Hey guys, tonight we're heading into a world of parasols, perfumed gardens, and the most delicately restrained glances history ever recorded. Picture it, a summer afternoon in Victorian England, where the lemonade is tepid, the scones are dense enough to anchor a barge, and your every blink might be misinterpreted as a marriage proposal. You're attending a garden party, yes, one of those parties, where flirtation is more like competitive chess and fancy boots. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're tuning in from somewhere far away or oddly close, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where everyone's listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand before a pair of wrought iron gates painted white sometime in the last decade, now delicately peeling like a croissant. There's a crunch of gravel beneath your scuffed leather boots, polished hours ago, now already dusty. Ahead, the garden sprawls like a confection, hedges cut into spirals, fountains gently burbling, and overzealous roses threatening to maim any elbow that swings too wide. You're dressed for the occasion, or at least you hope you are. The rules of dress weren't exactly written down anywhere. They were absorbed, whispered, or learned the hard way at last week's disastrous appearance at the Abernathy picnic. You still recall the scandalized gasp from Lady Featherstone when someone wore satin after 3 p.m. in the sunlight. You can't risk another misstep. As you approach the gravel loop leading to the garden's heart, you're not alone. Carriages crunch behind you. Parasols bloom in the hands of ladies. Somewhere, a very determined string quartet is tuning instruments with the dramatic flair of underpaid violinists. The air smells faintly of cut grass, lavender water, and something resembling boiled beef, because no matter how elegant the gathering, someone always packs a meaty pie. This isn't just a party. This is a battlefield. Not the bloody sort, thankfully. No lances or cannonballs, just fan flutters, eyebrow tilts, and potentially a swoon or two before sunset. Welcome to the Victorian garden party, where flirtation has rules, and the first one is clear. You cannot look like you want to be here. Desperation, or even enthusiasm, is the ultimate faux pas. The ideal entrance should say, "Oh, this? I stumbled in. I might leave in 5 minutes if the lemonade's too lemony." So you slow your steps. You feign mild disinterest. You gaze wistfully at a rose bush as if remembering an ancestor who once gardened. Historians still argue whether this cool detachment was driven by moral philosophy, the rigid class system, or simply a widespread fear of perspiration. Either way, entering too quickly, or worse, smiling, could mark you as tragically earnest. And tragically earnest people are doomed to sit beside Lady Blathersley all afternoon discussing her nephew's minor fungal ailment. So you hang back. Behind the curve of a hedge, a young lady accidentally drops her fan with all the grace of a trained ballerina pretending to trip. 3 gentlemen simultaneously move to retrieve it, only to freeze, uncertain whether assisting makes them gallant or gauche. Ah, the first move of the day's long and sleepy game. You scan the gathering. The host, Lord Everworth, stands by a large urn of something faintly steaming, gesturing vaguely at plants. His mustache resembles a moth attempting flight. You'll avoid him for now. He's known for cornering guests with painfully slow explanations of his fuchsia breeding techniques. Your goal is clear but unspoken: navigate the party without misreading signals, offending someone's spinster aunt, or accidentally declaring engagement via poorly timed glove removal. You pass under a trellis wound with honeysuckle, head high, eyes relaxed but alert. Everyone seems to be pretending they're not watching everyone else. This is normal. Expected. After all, the Victorian garden party was less a social gathering and more a sanctioned form of genteel espionage. And beneath it all, every guest is playing the same internal game. Who's spoken for? Who's interesting? Who's likely to quote poetry at you until your eyes glaze over? You settle beside a hydrangea bush. Hydrangeas are neutral territory. No one has ever been seduced, insulted, or emotionally ruined beside a hydrangea. They are the Switzerland of floral scenery. A server glides past with a tray of miniature sandwiches so tiny they might as well be edible postage stamps. You take one nibble? Cucumber. Predictable. Safe. Nearby, a gentleman in a delightfully paisley waistcoat is attempting to juggle a cravat, a teacup, and a complicated smirk. He is trying too hard. Across the lawn, two ladies pretend not to notice him while adjusting their parasols into optimal angular positions. We'll get into the parasols soon, don't worry. You overhear a snippet of conversation. And then she thanked him for complimenting her hat string. Imagine. Hat string. Scandalous stuff. The sort of verbal flirtation that can spiral into social exile if done before the fourth scone. It's all unfolding now, in low murmurs and covert glances. You take another sip of tepid tea. A bumblebee hovers near your elbow, possibly judging your fashion choices. The sky is clear, for now, but clouds loiter on the horizon with vague intent. The party is still in its early hours, everyone fresh, powdered, and not yet sun-dazed. This is the time to observe, to plan. And maybe, just maybe, to break a few rules, slowly, carefully, and with plausible deniability. But first we learn them. You haven't even made it to the lemonade urn and already you're embroiled in the first unspoken edict of Victorian garden flirtation. Do not arrive eager. That, dear listener, is Rule 1. This is not the Regency, after all, where dashing carriages might burst through hedgerows and declarations of love came in dramatic bursts of prose. No, in this time and place, the game is drawn out like a symphony played on a slow gramophone, every move restrained, every glance filtered through 4 layers of lace, lineage, and latent judgment. You may want to lock eyes with someone across the croquet field and be immediately swept into an afternoon of whispered botanical compliments and subtle, subtext-rich small talk. But alas, Victorian society frowns upon such efficiency. It all begins with timing your entrance. Not too early, or it looks desperate. Not too late, or it becomes performative. You must enter the party as if it was a spontaneous whim, even though you've spent 3 days picking out a lapel pin that communicates charming but not desperate. Historians still argue whether arriving with visible excitement was considered uncouth due to general emotional repression or simply because it risked looking like you didn't have 3 other garden parties to attend. One must always convey the illusion of social abundance, even if your dance card is emptier than a teacup after a bishop's visit. Take, for example, Miss Eliza Weatherby, known throughout 3 counties for arriving precisely 10 minutes after the first waltz at every garden party, regardless of start time. She once appeared on a foggy Tuesday in March just as a thunderstorm struck, and still managed to look nonchalantly dewy rather than soaked. That, my friend, is mastery. You, however, are a novice, albeit a sharply dressed one. You hover politely near the blackberry trellis, maintaining the perfect posture of someone who could leave at any moment but might stay if the conversation is vaguely tolerable. To your left, a young man in cream trousers and an unfortunately sincere expression attempts to charm a young lady with commentary on bees. The bees, it seems, are unimpressed. So is she. Busy creatures, he says. They are, she replies, without glancing up from her embroidery hoop. You pretend not to listen but file it away. Enthusiasm, it seems, must be filtered through at least 2 metaphors and 1 botanical reference. Nearby, a pair of widowed aunts are commenting on the pace of arrivals. One says, far too eager. She came before the string quartet finished tuning. The other clucks in agreement, as if someone had worn polka dots to a funeral. You step back from the trellis, letting your posture loosen into the genteel slouch of someone slightly amused but not fully invested. This is what the Victorians prized, composure above all else. And nowhere was that composure more tested than in the opening hour of a garden party. You are being watched, sized up, assessed for social value, conversational agility, and glove neatness. Let's be clear, flirting, here, is not a moment but a mood. It simmers. It doesn't boil. The worst thing you can do is arrive looking ready. Ready people are unpredictable. They could say anything. They might make a joke. Heaven forbid. Of course, there are exceptions. Some arrive early by design, to set the tone. These are often the hosts, or that cousin who has opinions about ferns and desperately wants someone, anyone, to admire the clamshell arrangement near the fountain. These people are not flirting. They are networking. It's a different battlefield entirely. For you, the trick is to become an elegant presence. Present, but not pressuring. Visible, but not seeking visibility. You nod at a pair of passing ladies, just enough to show you're polite, not so much that it implies prior familiarity. Because here, even the tilt of your head says volumes. And it must be said, timing isn't just about arrival. It's about movement. If you traverse the garden too quickly, say, straight from the entrance to the refreshment table, you appear goal-oriented. That's dreadfully modern. And dangerous. Goal-oriented people might ask direct questions, like would you care for a stroll? Before the appropriate fourth social loop. So instead you meander. A zigzag pattern between conversation pockets. You pause beside a hydrangea, laugh softly, even if no one said anything funny, and then continue on as if distracted by a squirrel or a profound thought about stone urns. It's not about being noticed. It's about being worth noticing. And looking like you're not trying to be. Which brings us, strangely, to the question of chairs. You do not sit too soon. Sitting gives the impression of settling, of choosing. It implies you've decided where the most interesting people are and have committed to remaining there. Far too bold. Far too stable. Instead, you half-perch. You lean with one elbow on the back of a wrought iron bench. You hover near the refreshments. You stand beside a garden statue as if in solemn contemplation of marble. This lets others come to you, which, of course, is Rule 1's hidden agenda. Remember that the average garden party guest in 1867 had a resting heart rate of slightly alarmed and a tolerance for forwardness equal to that of a startled hedgehog. If you blurt out a compliment or, gasp, laugh too loudly, you may find yourself relegated to the conversational outskirts, beside Mr. Bellington, who once talked uninterrupted for 27 minutes about drainpipes. Instead, you remain unhurried. Floaty. Breezy, like a misplaced dandelion seed drifting across the lawn. A mystery. An enigma. A guest who could, at any moment, leave for a piano recital or urgent lace emergency. Now someone's looking at you. A glance, quickly stolen, then dipped in shyness. A lady in lavender with gloves that suggest wealth and embroidery that suggests she embroidered them herself, which is doubly dangerous. You tilt your head, just a degree. A micro-expression that says, I see you seeing me, and I find it tolerable. Then, nothing more. Let the moment steep. Let curiosity bloom. You've done well, dear listener. Rule 1 is about restraint, yes, but it's also about creating intrigue. The kind that drifts through conversation like the scent of lilacs, and just might last through the third dance. Now, don't ruin it by winking. That's a later section. Let's talk about your parasol. It's not just a shade provider, fashion accessory, or means to prevent freckles, though heavens knows, freckles in 1863 might as well be a branding iron for common. No, the parasol in your hand, or, if you're more the observing sort, in someone else's, is a tool of communication. Which means you must know how to wield it. Rule 2, your parasol is a weapon. Now, not in the literal sense, although one suspects at least 3 Victorian matriarchs have used theirs to thwack an unwelcome suitor with admirable precision, but in the coded ballet of garden flirtation, the parasol is practically Morse code on a stick. Historians still argue whether the infamous language of the parasol was formally codified or merely invented by bored debutantes desperate for something, anything, to pass the time between petticoat fittings and jelly mold etiquette lectures. But what we do know is that the way a parasol was carried, twirled, opened, or even discarded was anything but random. Let's begin with the basics. Carriage. If a young lady carries her parasol tucked behind one shoulder, she's open to light conversation. If it's resting on the opposite hip, angled outward, she may be avoiding sun, or avoiding you. If it's pointed up, with the handle loosely swinging in one hand, she's either signaling boredom or rehearsing for her local Gilbert and Sullivan performance. And then we have the twirl. You'll want to study this move like it's the climax of a ballet. A slow twirl to the left means I see you, possibly find you interesting. A twirl to the right? Try again in the next century. A double twirl, then an abrupt stop. That's flirtation's equivalent of a warning shot. It's also worth noting that some young ladies took parasol communication to, shall we say, performative levels. Miss Letitia Dorning, for example, was notorious for parasol theatrics. She once simulated an entire sonnet using only wrist flicks and a series of increasingly alarmed glances over her shoulder. The recipient of this interpretive display proposed to her by sunset. She declined, of course. She was only testing new material. You, however, should proceed more modestly. Your parasol should be an extension of your posture, relaxed, elegant, and slightly mysterious. Never jab it into the ground. That's what gardeners are for. And never swing it idly like a cane, unless you wish to signal to the elderly that you've fully embraced your future as an eccentric spinster uncle. Now let's say you drop your parasol. This, too, carries consequence. In most cases, it signals distraction, or a desire to draw attention, preferably from the one guest currently pretending to inspect a rhododendron bush while obviously side-glancing your direction. But a parasol drop is a delicate move. It must be executed casually, as though you're too engrossed in thoughts of Goethe or embroidery to notice it slipping from your hand. If it clatters loudly on gravel, you've overcommit. If it lands open in a flower bed, that's a rescue mission, and an invitation for a conversation, assuming your rescuer isn't the local vicar, in which case, prepare for a long disquisition on sin and dampness. There's also parasol tilting, often used in group settings. A tilt towards someone might say, I'm listening to you more closely than to the others. A subtle tilt away might say, your comments on marmalade ratios have failed to enchant me. A sudden close and snap of the parasol might signal everything from offense to imminent digestion issues. Of course, if you're a gentleman, your parasol cues are more limited. For one thing, it's not your parasol. It's hers. Your role is to notice how she uses it and to interpret accordingly, without seeming like you're interpreting it, which is a paradox no Victorian man ever truly solved. There was, however, an infamous exception, Lord Pettigrew of Bath, who arrived at a garden fete armed with his own parasol, claiming it was experimental. The parasol was patterned with lemons. He claimed it was continental. He was quietly never invited back. So what do you do, dear listener, if you find yourself the subject of a parasol's attentions? You do not overreact. Do not suddenly straighten your cravat or knock over the lemonade urn in excitement. Instead, you return the favor with a look, a glance, fleeting but meaningful. Perhaps a nod, or if you're feeling bold, a measured compliment about the weather. But beware, if your compliment directly involves the parasol, what a splendid shade of blue, you risk seeming superficial. That's rule 2.5, never flatter the tool, flatter the artistry behind it. Something like, the way the light passes through your parasol's lace is rather poetic. Now that's flirtation. And let's not ignore the darker side of the parasol game, the block. Yes, should a lady tilt her parasol directly between you and her line of sight, that's no accident. You've been shaded. Quite literally. It's the social equivalent of closing a laptop while someone speaks. Gracefully brutal. On the other hand, if she offers you the parasol for a stroll, even temporarily, congratulations, she has essentially handed you the social reins of the next 15 minutes. Use them wisely. Offer a comment on the texture of the gravel path. Perhaps inquire about her views on dahlias. Absolutely do not bring up your chess record unless invited. Parasol etiquette was so deeply embedded that even satirical pamphlets of the time poked fun at it. One 1870s mock guide, titled A Gentleman's Defense Against the Folding Sun Weapon, warned that a misinterpreted flick of the parasol may cause irreparable attachment. Some scholars debate the actual consistency of these signals across regions. Did the parasol flick mean the same in Yorkshire as it did in Brighton? Was the double twirl universally flirty, or only flirtatious in Kent? No one truly knows. The ambiguity was half the charm. It left room for error, surprise, and endless tea-table speculation the next morning. And that, perhaps, is the true magic of the parasol. It added mystery to the mundane, turned shade into language, and allowed flirtation to unfold slowly, one silk-wrapped signal at a time. You adjust your grip on yours. Just so. Not too stiff. Not too languid. And now, look. Someone across the garden tilts theirs toward you. Just a bit. You don't smile yet. But you might. Let's say you've done everything right so far. You've arrived fashionably unhurried. You've twirled your parasol with the lazy precision of a debutante who isn't even trying. You've even stationed yourself beside a socially neutral shrubbery, pretending to enjoy cucumber sandwiches made with bread thinner than diplomatic intentions. Now, as conversation begins to ripple through the garden like a breeze that may or may not carry pollen and scandal, a small, dangerous instinct stirs in you. You want to make eye contact. Not just glance, really connect. And maybe even wink. But don't. For the love of crumpets, don't. Rule 3, never wink. Ever. You may be thinking, but what if it's subtle? What if it's slow, or ironic, or has a charming squint to it? No. The Victorian garden party is not a place for blinking suggestively at strangers. Not unless you're prepared to be seen as someone who once spent a bit too much time alone with foreign novels and strong tea. Winking, in Victorian social circles, was considered a breach of good taste, equal to humming secular tunes during church service or calling someone's bonnet whimsical in a condescending tone. It was bold, crude, and worst of all, unregulated. There were no formal codes for the wink. No system of etiquette to legitimize it. And that made it terrifying. Historians still argue whether the anti-wink sentiment arose from the rise of romantic literature, full of roguish characters who winked before stealing kisses or livestock, or whether it was a broader reaction to urbanization, where too many winks had been exchanged on foggy corners for morally ambiguous reasons. Whatever the cause, the result was clear. A wink in polite company was a social hand grenade. Let us consider a cautionary tale. In the summer of 1859, one Mr. Horace Bellamy winked at Miss Clara Fortenberry across a lawn dotted with peonies and potential in-laws. Miss Fortenberry, startled, dropped her fan and tripped over a decorative urn. The entire event unraveled like poorly stitched lace. Bellamy claimed the wink had been a squint due to sun glare. His defense was not accepted. He was promptly removed from several invitation lists, and eventually married a woman who preferred bluntness to nuance. They lived a long, eyebrow-arched life together in relative exile. The issue is that a wink skips steps. It jumps directly to intimacy without the polite choreography of introductions, glances, parasol flourishes, and chaperone-mediated eavesdropping. It's like trying to leapfrog over an entire dance to reach the final curtsy. And in Victorian society, skipping steps was the equivalent of skipping decency. So what do you do instead? You deploy the slow look away. It goes like this. You meet someone's eyes for just a moment, no longer than the time it takes to mentally select a jam from a breakfast tray. Then you look down, perhaps at your gloves, a flower, or an invisible memory. This subtle withdrawal suggests interest and control. You're not desperate. You're reflective. Mysterious. Maybe haunted by a tragic backstory involving a lost locket. Or, if you're feeling particularly daring, try the half-smile paired with environmental commentary. A brief upward curl of the mouth, then a glance skyward. Perhaps a murmured observation about the shape of the clouds or the pleasant silence of a bee-less moment. It invites conversation without demanding it. But winking? That signals you're skipping the menu and going straight for the dessert tray. And dessert, in this world, comes only after 3 courses of veiled small talk and a discussion of your family's sheep holdings. That said, not all facial gestures were banned. Eyebrow raising had its place, particularly the single, slow arch, which could express anything from disbelief to cautious approval. But again, it was context-dependent. A badly timed brow lift could turn a promising encounter into a 45-minute conversation with Lady Trotwell about the virtues of boiled cabbage. Of course, there were those who tested the boundaries. Flirtation always breeds rebellion. The Marquis of Delamere was infamous for something he called the almost wink. It was a slow blink with one eye slightly lingering. He claimed it was part of his breathing pattern. Ladies weren't sure whether to be flattered or to recommend he see a physician. No one ever accused him outright of winking, though, which was his game. He existed in the social gray area between gallant and guffaw-worthy. You might wonder how one tells the difference between a flirtation wink and, say, a twitch caused by pollen or an unfortunate gnat encounter. The answer? You can't. Which is why the entire genre of expression was banned. Even in literature, winking had a reputation. Jane Austen never wrote a single character who winked. Dickens occasionally flirted with it, figuratively and literally, but often reserved the gesture for unsavory types, coachmen, or streetwise boys who knew too much about pickpocketing. In short, it was not a behavior associated with those interested in a courtship of poise and inheritance. So here you are, nestled near a stone bird bath, fidgeting idly with a trailing bit of ivy. You lock eyes, briefly, with a tall figure in a soft moss-colored jacket. There's a mutual moment of pause, like the soft intake of air before a string quartet resumes playing. You think, should I? No. You should not. Instead, you lower your gaze and adjust your glove. A motion not too deliberate. Just a quiet invitation to notice you again later. And maybe, later on, after tea, after the formal promenade, after at least one vague reference to Shakespeare, you can share a real smile. Not a grin. Not a smirk. A smile so faint and fleeting that someone has to earn it. Because that's how flirtation works here. It's not about declarations. It's about suggestion. Not about leaps. About glides. And if you really must convey cheekiness, use your fan. So, you've resisted the urge to wink. Well done. You've now passed through one of the most dangerous temptations of the Victorian garden flirtation gauntlet. But just when you think you're safe, comfortable even, something happens. You drop a glove. It slips from your fingers in a moment of distraction, maybe while reaching for a cherry tart or pretending to admire a swan-shaped topiary. And now it lies there, silk and subtle, like an abandoned promise on the gravel path. Rule 4. Gloves speak louder than words. Yes, gloves. Those dainty, pristine, sweat-collecting hand prisons. You thought they were just there to protect your fingers from sun and scandal. But no, gloves were a communication system so elaborate, so precise, that it made Morse code look like an impatient sneeze. Gloves, dear listener, were loaded weapons in the world of flirtation. Consider this. The average Victorian garden party attendee owned no fewer than 6 types of gloves, each for different hours of the day, levels of formality, sleeve lengths, and general emotional preparedness. Some were kid leather, others lace, and still others so thin they practically melted if exposed to stern glances. Historians still argue whether the glove drop originated as a flirtation tool or a theatrical mishap repurposed by clever ladies. What is certain is that once the gesture caught on, it was nearly impossible to distinguish an accident from an invitation. Drop a glove at the feet of someone? That could mean, please return this and perhaps ask about my embroidery. Drop it and don't retrieve it? I noticed you. Do something gallant. Retrieve it yourself with a sharp movement? I noticed you, but I am pretending I didn't. Leave it on a bench altogether? That's essentially posting a billboard. I sat here. I mattered. And the touch, oh, the touch. If someone handed your glove back with more than 3 fingers? Intimate. If they used just 2? Respectful. If they merely gestured toward it and said, you seem to have dropped this, without picking it up? Social Siberia. You stand now in just such a moment. Your glove lies on the gravel, 1 inch from the edge of the lemonade cloth. You freeze. The moment stretches. A lady to your left glances. A gentleman across from you hesitates. And finally, a young woman, gloves intact, posture immaculate, swoops in and returns it with an arched brow and no words. Just the brow. And a half-step backward. She knows the rules. She knows you know the rules. Now you both know that you know. Of course, it wasn't all about dropping things. The way gloves were worn also sent messages. A glove removed slowly could mean flirtation, especially if done finger by finger, with mild but unmistakable flair. It was considered suggestive, though in a way that would make modern romance look like a brass band. One historical account from 1874 describes a gentleman nearly fainting when a widow removed her gloves too quickly during a game of parlor charades. He later claimed he saw her wrist in its entirety. Naturally, they were married the following spring. Then there's the twist, a subtle rotation of the glove at the wrist, typically while appearing to examine flowers or dust. That movement, if observed, was often interpreted as a request for someone to come closer, but not too close. And let's not forget glove material. Lace gloves? Playful. Satin? Daring. Black gloves? Potentially mourning, unless paired with red trim, in which case, absolutely not mourning. That's a signal. A very saucy one. For men, glove rules were simpler, but still strict. Wearing gloves to greet a lady? Polite. Keeping them on while eating strawberries? Vulgar. Removing them too soon? Presumptuous. And offering to help someone adjust their glove? Well, that was one of the boldest moves in the game. As intimate as asking someone to co-author a poem. Now, a word of caution. Too many glove moves too fast can overwhelm even the most seasoned observer. It's like shouting into a whispering room. Best to keep it minimal, one drop, one tug, maybe a thoughtful adjustment, while standing beside a particularly dramatic urn. At this moment, as you slip your glove back onto your hand, you realize someone is watching. Not staring, just watching. Their expression is unreadable, their posture artfully relaxed. And you feel a flicker of something. A shared understanding of the ridiculous precision you're all upholding. It's absurd. It's elegant. It's fun. Which brings us to one more truth of the glove game. Every participant knew it was silly. That was the charm. In a society where a misplaced spoon could tarnish a reputation, gloves gave people a way to play. Quietly. Safely. With plausible deniability. If caught, you could always say, "Oh, I simply dropped it," or "I was adjusting the stitching." And no one could prove otherwise, though Aunt Theodosia might raise an eyebrow so arched it belonged in a cathedral. By now, the sun has shifted just enough to cast a long shadow across the garden path. The lemonade is beginning to sweat. Somewhere, someone is fainting, either from heat or dramatic necessity. And yet, the games continue. You take a step forward, glove secured, posture perfected. You offer a gentle smile to no one in particular, the kind that might be noticed. Or might not. But one thing's certain, your gloves have done more talking than your lips have. And in Victorian flirtation, that's how it's supposed to be. Now, shall we move on to Rule 5? Spoiler, it involves velvet waistcoats, subtle insults, and the dangerous art of not showing off. You've survived the glove games. Your parasol has not betrayed you. And crucially, you've made no unauthorized winking attempts. You're doing quite well. But now you begin to notice something subtle. As the garden fills with guests, and the tea begins to flow lukewarm, predictably, there's a change in energy. Certain figures begin to draw glances, elegant silhouettes moving gracefully between fountains and footpaths, lace hems floating just above dew-damp grass. And yet, those drawing attention are not always the most obviously dressed. This leads us to Rule 5, peacocking is for peasants. In modern terms, you might say try-hard energy is a bit of a social death spiral. And in the context of a Victorian garden party, where every motion is deliberate, and every glance weighs approximately one emotional stone, trying too hard is the cardinal sin. That's not to say people weren't dressed. Oh, they were. You've never seen this much brocade without a curtain rod attached. But there was a difference between being well-appointed and being what Lady Tunbridge once referred to as a ruffled assault on the eyes. Take, for example, Mr. Barnaby Wexler. Barnaby once attended a luncheon in a turquoise waistcoat embroidered with tiny gold swans, each swan wearing a monocle. The effect was memorable, but not in the way he'd hoped. Guests whispered about him for weeks, though rarely while facing in his direction. His fashion had crossed the fine lace-trimmed line between confidence and costume. The art of Victorian flirtation, after all, is restraint. You're here to be noticed in the way perfume lingers, not in the way a trumpet announces supper. Historians still argue whether subtlety became the norm out of actual good taste, or simply because flaunting wealth was considered vulgar in front of the poorer cousins everyone still had to invite. Regardless, the result was the same. The more quietly elegant you appeared, the more attractive your mystery. So, what's the right amount of flair? A single accessory that sparks conversation, a curious cravat pin, perhaps, or a ribbon with just a hint of rebellious coloring. Something someone might compliment with a lowered voice, forcing you both into proximity. Not a full peacock tail, just a feather tucked somewhere clever. For ladies, it was even trickier. You were expected to look lovely, of course, but too much sparkle in daylight was practically a cry for help. Rhinestones before sunset? Scandal. A feather taller than a candle? Dangerous. Even wearing deep colors during a daytime event could raise whispers that your chaperone had given up. And so, subtle rebellions became the thing. A pattern hem that peeked beneath the expected muslin. A pin borrowed from a brother's collection. Once, it said, a lady at a Cheltenham garden party wore green, forest green. In the morning, she became a legend. Right now, you stand beside the clover-lined path, watching the players step into place. One man adjusts his cuffs, revealing a hint of embroidered initials. Another leans forward to compliment a lady's bonnet, but does so while brushing back his sleeve to expose a timepiece that cost more than the entire buffet table. It's all coded. But the code must be elegant. If your jacket says, "Look what I own," you've already lost. If it whispers, "I'm the sort of person who could own more," but chooses this, you're in the running. A true master of garden flirtation allows their attire to say something vague but appealing, like, "I once read Latin poetry in the rain and thought deeply about it later while polishing silver." You decide to test the waters. Casually, you reach up to adjust your collar, not for function, but to reveal just the edge of your handkerchief. It's silk, with a discreet stitch of your initials. You let the edge peek, just a little, as you step closer to the sundial where a small group is discussing the merits of shade-grown strawberries. No one comments right away. That's good. Then, from your left, "That's a very fine stitch." The voice is low. Even. A compliment disguised as an observation. You smile, just enough to acknowledge it, and offer back a nod that says, "Yes, and I did not pay anyone too much for it, either." You're learning. One of the most fascinating elements of this understated performance is how heavily it leans on implication. Saying too much was dangerous. Compliments had to walk the tightrope between dull and too personal. Clothing became a conversation in silence. How you dressed said more than anything you actually spoke. And yes, that meant mistakes were brutal. Once, a gentleman wore a novelty tie pin in the shape of a pineapple. No one addressed it directly, but every time he attempted to join a group, a sudden mention of tropical climates or colonial tariffs would surface. He was defeated before the sandwiches even made it out. Even posture played a role. Standing too stiffly implied nervousness. Too relaxed, and you seemed like the sort of person who might discuss railroads or, worse, money. The ideal stance? One elbow loose, spine upright but yielding, like a willow contemplating poetry. Remember, in this world, mystery is currency. If someone can't quite decide whether your waistcoat is French or simply well dyed, you're doing well. If your boots look polished but not too polished, as though you care about detail but still walk through grass on purpose, that's peak allure. And always, check your accessories. A tarnished cufflink might suggest a backstory. A pristine one? Too eager. You want to imply that you once lost a button while rescuing a goose and never replaced it quite right, but you'd rather not talk about it. Now, as you adjust your parasol to block the late afternoon sun, you catch sight of a lady in pale gray linen. Her collar is fastened with a simple pearl brooch, but the clasp is turned slightly askew. Deliberately? Or carelessly? You wonder what that misaligned pin might mean. A message? A rebellion? An accident? You don't ask. You simply glance once, then look away, because mystery, darling, is everything. You've now grasped the subtle art of not looking like you're trying, which, as it turns out, is the primary form of effort at a Victorian garden party. And it's paying off. You're noticed, but not loudly. You're interesting, but not obvious. You're the story someone else will whisper about later over tea cakes. But let's say someone has decided to approach you. A young lady or gentleman whose gloves are impeccable, whose parasol angles have hinted at interest, whose fan may or may not have fluttered your way. We'll get to those fans soon, I promise. The moment has come. You're introduced. Now here's the problem. You suddenly want to say their name. You like their name. You'd like to repeat it, maybe attach it to a comment about roses or offer it softly after a particularly clever joke. Rule 6. Don't say her name too soon. This one sounds simple, but it might be the rule most commonly broken. And when broken, it often causes enough social ripples to capsize entire friendship circles. Names, you see, were considered sacred currency in Victorian social circles. A person's name wasn't something you tossed around like a shuttlecock at a country fete. It was handled with reverence, or, at the very least, with extreme caution. Saying it too soon, too familiarly, or without proper cause was equivalent to fast-forwarding the entire plot of a serialized romance novel. Historians still debate why names carried such charge. Was it tied to formality, or the deeply ingrained sense that a name invoked not just a person, but their family, their status, and an unspoken ledger of moral credit? Perhaps it was simply about control. Names, when used correctly, kept things civil. When used carelessly, they ignited gossip. You've now been introduced to a Miss Lydia Feathercombe. You are permitted, for the time being, to refer to her only in second-person address or through general phrases like Miss Feathercombe, Madam, or that remarkable individual with a fascinating relationship to strawberry tarts. First names are forbidden, unless, of course, she uses yours first. In which case, you may proceed one syllable at a time. This may seem exhausting. And yes, it is. But remember, everything about Victorian flirtation is a dance, and this part is the opening measure. Calling someone by their first name is like skipping a whole bar of music. It doesn't show intimacy, it shows clumsiness. Now, in some rare circumstances, a nickname might be used. This usually required a long-standing acquaintance, shared schoolyard history, or a direct invitation to do so. One infamous case in 1872 involved a gentleman who called Miss Georgina Whittleby Georgie within 3 minutes of being introduced. She reportedly choked on her tea biscuit and refused to speak to him for the remainder of the summer. The man later joined a monastery, allegedly. You may, however, use indirect forms of address that suggest familiarity while technically obeying the rules. These include: Miss Feathercombe, I wonder if you've noticed the odd behavior of the bees today. Madam, I believe you may have bested me in identifying that varietal of rose. Some say the lady in grey linen has exceptional taste in garden paths. See what you're doing there. You're building intrigue while playing within boundaries. It's like whispering through lace. Now, suppose you're in a group and someone else, say, an overeager cousin visiting from abroad, starts throwing out first names like confetti. Do not follow their lead. You, dear listener, are above that. Let them be remembered as the one who said Beatrice before the salmon sandwiches. You will remain remembered as tasteful, mysterious, and correctly restrained. There's an art to waiting for the right moment to use someone's name. Sometimes, that moment never arrives. Sometimes, it happens quite suddenly, like when Miss Feathercombe drops her fan, accidentally or not, and in the pause that follows, she looks up and quietly says, "You may call me Lydia." Your heart skips, not just from the intimacy of it, but because it's the social equivalent of a velvet glove being removed under candlelight. You do not grin. You do not gasp. You respond smoothly, with practiced ease. Then, Lydia, you say gently, "May I offer you the shade of this rather nosy pear tree?" See? That's the game. Names, once exchanged in intimacy, were like keys. But lose them too early, or misuse them, and they clatter like dropped cutlery in a silent drawing room. There was also a danger in assuming. Suppose someone says their name too early in conversation. Perhaps they're foreign, or American, or simply unaware of the nuance. Don't leap on it. Let it hang. Say something like, How charming! I imagine it suits you perfectly. This implies acknowledgement, but not entitlement. Which is exactly what Victorian flirtation demanded: curiosity, not claim. And here's a secret trick: using someone's title in a compliment. Not their name, just their station. Miss Feathercombe seems to have a gift for creating quiet in crowded places. She does, someone will say. And there you are, approved, admired, and still mysterious. Of course, you may overhear others whispering names. This is allowed. Whispers are an entirely different category of etiquette, governed less by rules and more by volume. A whispered first name has plausible deniability. A spoken first name carries consequence. Some scholars note the rise of name anxiety in correspondence as well. Letters exchanged after garden parties were often peppered with vague salutations. To the lady of the lemonade walk, or to a certain someone with impeccable taste in fans. Why? Because until someone offered their name freely, it was risky to even write it down. You step now into the gravel ring near the rose arbor, your conversation with Miss Lydia, still humming quietly in the air. She glances toward you, then turns away just as quickly. You feel the faintest pull of something delightful. Forbidden. Earned. Names, after all, are beginnings. And you've just been given one. Now don't say it too often. Or too loudly. Or within earshot of her aunt. Especially not her aunt. That woman could weaponize a raised eyebrow into a 3-week scandal. Now that you've been granted a name, Lydia, softly given, delicately received, you might be feeling confident. Maybe even a little fluttery inside, like a silk ribbon caught in a June breeze. But hold your parasols, dear listener, because if there's one item that can upend your carefully balanced composure faster than an overboiled teapot, it's this. Rule 7. The language of fans. Yes. Fans. Those deceptively innocent, feathered or lacy accessories that do far more than keep one cool or obscure an unflattering facial twitch. In the realm of Victorian flirtation, the fan is an instrument of communication, of strategy, of high-stakes emotional warfare conducted in complete silence. You might be standing near the rose arbor now, watching Lydia. Yes, we can say her name, once per section, don't get greedy, watching her lift her fan to her face. A gentle flutter. A tap on the chin. A slow, deliberate close. Do you know what she's saying? No? Let's fix that. The fan language, or flirtation code, as it was called in polite pamphlets and deeply unserious etiquette columns, was a kind of gestural Morse code. And while some historians believe it was invented by clever society ladies as a joke on clueless suitors, others insist it had real power. And honestly, both feel equally likely. We do know this. By the 1860s, fan etiquette had taken hold of fashionable society, particularly in the summer months, when the combination of corsetry, heat, and too much gooseberry tart made verbal flirtation both exhausting and risky. Here are a few key fan gestures you'll need to survive the day. Fan slowly closed and reopened. I'm intrigued, but don't press your luck. Fan held open in front of the face. I'm observing you. With suspicion. Tapping the fan against the palm. We are being watched. Speak carefully. Fan fluttered rapidly. You've flustered me. Possibly on purpose. Possibly fatally. Fan rested on the left cheek. Yes. Fan rested on the right cheek. No. Fan twirled in the left hand. Please leave me alone so I can pretend to admire begonias. Fan dropped entirely. Marry me, or at least pretend to offer lemonade while we talk alone. And those are just the documented signals. There were regional variations, social circle quirks, and individual signatures. Some particularly clever ladies developed multi-stage messages, where one gesture indicated flirtation and the next suggested follow-up instructions, like where to meet for a discreet conversation near the croquet lawn. Now, here's the trick. These fan movements could never appear too deliberate. If they looked planned, they became performance. If they were too casual, they were missed. You had to walk the razor-thin line between spontaneity and choreography. Or, as one poet once put it, as though the breeze itself were plotting your romance. You now watch Lydia, No extra mentions, rules are rules. Tap her fan lightly against her left wrist. What does that mean? Nothing. Or everything. Because not every gesture has a universal meaning. Sometimes a tap is just a tap. And therein lies the genius, plausible deniability. You could deny, deflect, or reinterpret almost anything. Historians still argue whether the ambiguity of fan language was intentional or accidental. One camp believes it was a secret code crafted by women to navigate rigid gender expectations. Another believes it was just a series of unconscious fidgets that society decided to romanticize. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, like most good scandals. Gentlemen were generally less fluent in the language of fans. Many relied on pattern recognition and frantic eye contact to interpret what was being signaled. A few bold types kept guidebooks tucked in coat pockets. One brave soul in 1871 was said to have practiced fan signal memorization daily, only to panic and misread a flick for a flourish. He proposed marriage to the wrong sister. They married anyway, eventually opened a millinery shop, and never spoke of fans again. If you're a gentleman at this garden party, here's what not to do. Do not comment directly on the fan movements. Do not attempt to mimic them. Do not assume a flutter means affection. It might just be wasps. Instead, your job is to notice, not interpret. If a fan is fluttered rapidly in your direction and followed by a slightly arched brow and a downward glance, you may consider initiating a conversation about something charmingly non-threatening, like dandelions or obscure forms of embroidery. As with gloves, fans offered a way to speak without speaking, an absolutely vital feature in a society where chaperones sprouted like daisies and eavesdropping was considered both impolite and wildly popular. You may have heard stories of fan duels, and yes, they existed. Not physical clashes, of course, but silent competitions, two ladies sitting side by side, each fanning at different tempos, angles, and rhythms, attempting to captivate the attention of a single distracted suitor. Like synchronized swimming with social consequences. You're beginning to understand now how the garden party is less about what's said and more about what's gestured. You stand near the refreshments, sipping tepid tea, while an entire novella unfolds in lace and breeze and blink. And then, it happens. Across the gravel, she lowers her fan, slowly. Not dramatically, not with flair. Just enough to let you see her smile. Not a grin. Not a beam. Just a slight, knowing smile, as if to say, you've kept up so far. You nod, almost imperceptibly, and take a sip of your tea so that no one can say you responded too quickly. The fan closes. Conversation resumes around you. A bee hums lazily past. A child somewhere screams the word pigeon for no reason anyone can discern. And just like that, the moment passes. But it was there. So remember this, at a Victorian garden party, a fan isn't just a fan. It's a language, a shield, a sword. It's flirtation rendered art. And if you're lucky, and watchful, and just bold enough, you might get to read it. Now on to the roses. Because all meaningful flirtation eventually leads to Rule 8. And thorns. You're navigating the afternoon beautifully now, a proper garden party whisper, never quite the center, never quite forgotten. You've survived parasol diplomacy, fan dramatics, the treacherous realm of glove-based gossip. You've spoken a name, just once, avoided peacocking, and resisted the temptations of ill-timed winks. So where do you go now, with confidence rising like a well-proofed crumpet? You go toward the roses. Rule 8. Stay near the rose bushes. Ah yes, the florid beating heart of any respectable Victorian garden. Roses weren't just for decoration. They were the backdrop of flirtation, the unofficial stage of many a soft-spoken confession and several near proposals tragically interrupted by rogue bees. You might ask, why roses? And it's a fair question, especially considering they're thorny, attract insects, and tend to shed dramatically when touched by enthusiastic bonnets. But that's precisely the point. Roses had narrative value. They gave a moment visual poetry. A conversation by the trellis? Romantic. A comment near the begonias? Harmless. But whispering about weather patterns beside blooming crimson petals? That could ripple through a social circle like jam through lace. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of rose-centered courtship moments came from actual tradition or just clever landscaping. Either way, one thing is certain. When two individuals find themselves coincidentally near a rose bush, people pay attention. So here you are now, near the rose arbor, its wooden arch laced with climbing blooms, their colors soft as spun sugar. A few petals have already begun to drift lazily downward like polite confetti. And just to your right, someone else has arrived. Perhaps it's Lydia. It's Lydia. She's standing with one gloved hand resting on the wooden trellis, gazing just off to the side. Never directly at you. That would be obvious. You're both within arm's reach of full-bloom roses, which means everyone in the general vicinity has now mentally circled your names together in an imaginary guest book. You are now a possibility. But mind yourself. The rose zone is both opportunity and trap. Enter too eagerly and you'll look rehearsed. Linger too long, and you'll seem clingy, or worse, in possession of fewer social options. The correct move? Comment on the roses. Not the person. Not the moment. The roses. You can smell them before you see them, you say lightly. It's almost theatrical. Lydia gives the faintest nod. They are theatrical. I think they know it. And now you're in. That's a conversation, and a shared joke. The best kind of flirtation. Not declarations. Observations. Roses, of course, weren't just symbolic. They were coded. The Victorians were obsessed with floriography, the language of flowers. A red rose stood for love. A white one, purity or sometimes silence. Yellow? Jealousy. Pink? Admiration or grace, depending on which garden column you subscribed to. This meant that conversations near rose bushes weren't just aesthetically appealing, they were layered with meaning. If someone handed you a red rose unprompted, it was a scandal in a stem. If they plucked a petal and handed that to you, that was poetry. And if they sniffed a rose and walked away, that was either deep symbolism or hay fever. You had to know your audience. You and Lydia, still just one mention, let's not lose our heads. Now share a glance as a child runs past with a half-melted strawberry tart, completely oblivious to the centuries of coded gestures occurring within arm's reach. You step just slightly closer to the trellis. Not into her space, heavens no, but into shared shade. It's cooler here. Calmer. Somewhere behind you, someone is absolutely watching. Let them. Because here's the hidden magic of the rose zone, it allows people to assume. And assumptions are the seeds of courtship. Take, for instance, the curious case of the Fairchild twins, Eleanor and Eugenia, who were once seen beside the same rose bush with two different suitors on the same afternoon. For weeks, no one could recall who had stood where, or with whom. Rumors blossomed like, well, roses. One twin received a poem. The other got a letter of apology. Neither ever clarified. And then there's Lord Tilling. He once gifted a lady a yellow rose without checking his handbook. She interpreted it as jealousy. He'd meant friendship. She responded by gifting him a thistle the next day, which, depending on the reference guide, meant either defiance, or you have spinach in your teeth. Amazingly, they ended up married. Go figure. So when standing near the rose bushes, play it cool. Never touch the roses unless invited to do so. Offering one is a high-stakes move. Accepting one? Even riskier. You, naturally, are playing it safe. You let your fingertips barely graze a hanging bloom, not to pick, not to comment on color, just to notice. You're not trying to draw attention, but if someone notices your touch, well, who could blame them? I heard someone once trained roses to grow in the shape of initials, you say, gently. I doubt that, Lydia replies, with a smile that says she doesn't doubt it at all. And just like that, the rosebush has fulfilled its destiny. It has given you something to say that isn't about feelings, or intention, or fan signals. It's given you a conversation point wrapped in petals and plausible deniability. Now, it's important to note that not all gardens use roses for flirtation. In some circles, it was considered passé, or even melodramatic. But at this party? They're blooming. And so are your chances. So when you step away, because yes, you must eventually step away, do so with grace. Do not glance back. Do not linger. The rose zone must always retain a whiff of magic. If you loiter too long, it becomes a hedge. If you treat it right, it becomes a story. And trust me, someone will be telling that story tonight over teacups. She was near the roses, and he said something about theater. It was he who mentioned the theater? I heard it was she. And so the narrative grows, thorny and delicate. Just like the rose. The roses are behind you now. You've walked away with precisely the right amount of mystery, leaving petals in your wake, and questions in others' minds. You're learning the rhythm. You're speaking the language. But your next step may be the most treacherous of all. You've been invited to dance. Rule 9. Dance like no one's watching, but everyone is. The Victorian garden party dance was a flirtation ritual wrapped in elegance, corsets, and ankle-level chaos. At first glance, it looks serene, couples gliding across the lawn, guided by a string quartet and a chaperone's disapproving squint. But do not be fooled. The dance floor, especially outdoors, was the courtship crucible. You approach the open lawn where the musicians have struck up something lively but respectable. It might be a quadrille, or a waltz, or one of those vaguely European numbers that involves more bowing than actual movement. The steps are complicated, the expectations stifling, and the grass, uneven. This is no place for the unprepared. You remove your gloves, as tradition demands. Any true partner deserves the sensation of genuine, unloved fingertips pressing against their palm, though only briefly, and only with the most sanitary of intentions. Lydia, yes, we're still pacing the name, has accepted your offer with a nod and a smile that borders dangerously close to flirtatious. The two of you take your place in the formation. Two couples here, another there, all shuffling gently into place like chess pieces trying not to fall in love. Dancing at a Victorian garden party was a performance not just of footwork, but of self-control. One wrong step and you could find your toe tangled in the hem of someone's great-aunt. One accidental spin too far, and you've whirled into a gazebo, knocking over lemonade and destiny. But oh, when it's done right, it's electric. The music starts. The dance begins. Historians still argue whether the quadrille was invented by someone who hated simplicity. The steps are intricate: turn, pause, sidestep, advance, retreat. Smile. Pretend you're not entirely focused on where Lydia's hand fits into yours. Then, switch partners. Yes, that's the twist. Most garden dances involve rotation. You're granted only fleeting moments with your intended. And yet, those stolen seconds become sacred. You must communicate everything with your posture, your pace, your poise. She meets your eyes, briefly, as the spin returns her to your arm. You do not speak. That would be crass. But your grip softens just enough to say, I'm still here. Your movements should say, I am present, but not possessive. Your smile must suggest, I am amused, but not desperate. The dance is an act of high-stakes neutrality. And make no mistake, everyone is watching. Seated matrons, sipping tepid punch. Observant fathers pretending to read plant catalogs. Younger siblings trying to decode the subtext. You are dancing not just with a person, but in front of a panel of judgment armed with scones. Take the example of Miss Constance Burling, who once danced an entire polka with one eyebrow raised. That single expression led to 5 inquiries, 2 broken engagements, and a sonnet that was banned from church recitation. Or consider poor Thomas Greer, who tripped during a schottische and accidentally grasped the hem of Lady Minton's sleeve. That sleeve tore. Her dog barked. A rumor spread that he was fleeing an illicit duel. He was merely allergic to grass. Which brings us to an important point: the shoes. You're wearing the correct pair, I hope. Flat-soled, soft enough to glide, firm enough to withstand gravel surprise attacks. Dance shoes were chosen with the care of naval engineers. They had to impress without distracting. If they squeaked, you were doomed. If they glittered, you were really doomed. The music shifts now, something slower. More tender. Less parlor game, more poetry. Lydia's hand is in yours again. There's a breath of space between you, exactly what propriety demands, but her fan is tucked away now, and her gloves are looped in her free hand. This is not an accident. You take a step forward. She matches it. The music floats around you like gauze. There's no need for words. Not now. The conversation is in the footfalls, the tempo, the stillness of her gaze when the turn brings her face close to yours. But then you sense it. The gaze of someone just off to the side. A chaperone. Possibly an aunt. The dreaded, hovering presence of tea-stained reputation protection. You break eye contact with Lydia a moment too soon. She smiles, not with mockery, but with full knowledge of what's just happened. That, too, is part of the game. Victorian garden dances weren't about losing yourself in passion. They were about managing it. Performing just enough longing to cause talk, never enough to cause scandal. And this leads us to a tricky social art, the exit. When the music ends, you bow. She curtsies. You do not immediately scurry back to her side for lemonade and a full debrief. That's what amateurs do. You separate, let the tension linger. Maybe speak to someone else. Maybe admire a birdbath. Show the world, and Lydia, that the dance was meaningful, but not consuming. Because the next move might be hers. Or someone else's. And that is the secret of dancing at a Victorian garden party. It's not just a pastime. It's a message. A moving letter. A letter sealed not with wax, but with timing. As you stand now beneath a tall elm, dabbing at your brow with a discreet handkerchief, you feel a rush of something rare and exciting. You didn't stumble. You weren't too eager. You didn't step on anyone's lace hem that you know of. And best of all, someone chose to dance with you, then smiled again afterward. You begin to understand why these garden parties matter so much. Not for the cakes or music or overly complex dancing formats, but for the moments like that. And now, as your heart finally begins to slow, someone approaches with a tray of sponge cakes and scandalous smiles. You take one, nod politely, and prepare for Rule 10. Because what's dancing without gossip? The dance is behind you. Your gloves are back on. Your breath is steady, your hair is mildly wind-kissed but within acceptable bounds of rakish dishevelment. You've executed one of the most socially fraught rituals of the entire party with poise, charm, and only one moment of accidental eye contact with a nearby duck. But here's the thing, dear listener, the dance was only half the battle. Because now you're being discussed. Rule 10. Gossip is a courtship tool. Yes, gossip. The gentle, pastel-colored currency of the Victorian social world. You may think gossip is petty or unkind, and sometimes, sure, it can be, but here, at this very English garden party, it's more than that. It's the bloodstream of the event. It's how alliances are formed, rivalries are fueled, and romance is allowed to grow in the cracks between sandwiches. The moment your name passed Lydia's lips, that single moment, still echoing in your ears, you became part of the narrative. And the narrative, as you'll soon see, is woven not with facts but with impressions, most of which are exaggerated and slightly flour-dusted. As you drift toward the refreshment table, where a plate of sponge cake wobbles suspiciously beside a bowl of underripe strawberries, you can hear it beginning. Behind you, two elderly women exchange whispers. You don't hear the words, but the tone is unmistakable, arch approval, with a splash of speculative mischief. To your left, a gentleman chuckles softly into his teacup and glances at you as if you've become a character in his novella. Somewhere by the rose arbor, someone mutters your name, twice, softly, like a prayer or a warning. It's working. Because, in truth, flirtation in Victorian society didn't end when you walked away from someone. It began the moment someone else noticed you talking. Historians still argue whether the proliferation of garden gossip was due to boredom, social control, or simply a deep national love of indirect storytelling. One 19th-century etiquette writer referred to gossip as a polite person's diary, gently outsourced. That's both clever and terrifyingly accurate. And make no mistake, not all gossip was malicious. Much of it was speculative, fond, almost artistic in its fabrication. She turned her fan inward. Surely that means something, someone might say. He adjusted his cravat twice before speaking to her. Was that nerves, or indigestion? He danced with her, and ate the same sponge cake she did. That's practically a vow. You, meanwhile, are pretending to be absorbed in a biscuit. It is dense. It tastes like something a baker would produce under duress. But it gives you cover. This is part of the ritual. Pretend you don't notice. Let gossip swirl around you like bees around marmalade. Don't sweat at it. That only makes it more aggressive. Now, if you're clever, and I suspect you are, you'll feed the gossip without ever confirming it. You might say something like, "Oh, the dance? Quite pleasant. Remarkable tempo." Or, if asked directly about Lydia, "An observant conversationalist. Very good with metaphor." These are the kinds of answers that leave room for embellishment. Be warned, the wrong kind of answer can kill a rumor instantly. She was fine. Nice, I suppose? Didn't notice much. These statements are the equivalent of social chloroform. No one talks about a lukewarm romance. They talk about the one with heat beneath the lace. This is why cake is crucial. Sponge cake is the gossip food of choice. Because everyone gathers around it, everyone eats too much of it, and everyone feels just uninhibited enough, thanks to sugar and mild fatigue, to whisper something they wouldn't dare say with an empty mouth. Now let's address counter-gossip. Not all whispers will be flattering. Someone may suggest that your dancing was too confident, that your laugh was a touch familiar, that your shoes are of a distinctly Scottish persuasion. You must learn the art of passive self-defense. For example, if someone comments that you seemed overly fond of rose-scented handkerchiefs, you might respond, with a mild chuckle, "Well, roses are persistent little things, aren't they?" You've neither confirmed nor denied. You've made yourself just slippery enough to be intriguing. The other power of gossip is amplification. Let's say Lydia smiles at you during the long game later. Oh yes, croquet is coming. That moment, barely noticed in real time, will grow in the retelling. By tomorrow morning, someone will swear she laughed at your joke. Someone else will say she touched your arm. A third will claim you quoted poetry, which you absolutely did not. You merely described a goose as philosophical. These embellishments are helpful. They do the work for you. And better still, they allow both of you to maintain deniability while benefiting from narrative momentum. This is also why garden parties had observers. Not just guests, but people who came purely to see and be seen seeing. These included widowed aunts, dubious cousins, and unmarried sisters who had given up on flirtation but not on judging it. If you catch the eye of one such observer and receive a nod, or even better, a squint, you're doing well. It means you've passed into social mythology. Of course, gossip's true power lies in feedback loops. If Lydia hears that people are whispering about you and her, and she neither denies nor confirms, she's participating in the courtship without uttering a word. Which brings us to a vital tool, strategic absence. After a promising interaction, don't linger. Don't hover by the shrubbery like a misplaced scarecrow. Disappear. Take a slow stroll around the fish pond. Converse briefly with someone unrelated, preferably an older guest with a reputation for impartiality. Why? Because it allows the gossip to breathe, to ferment. You become the flavor left on the palate after a particularly good cake. And later, when you return, you'll be greeted not as a suitor, but as a subject of interest. Which, in Victorian terms, is practically a proposal. So remember, the whispered word has power. It may not be fair. It may not even be accurate. But in the carefully constructed theater of a garden party, it is everything. Now, finish that sponge cake, discreetly, and steel yourself. Rain clouds are gathering. And with them, Rule 11. Because a little drizzle can change everything. You feel the shift before you hear it. The change in air pressure, the faint scent of ozone curling between ivy-wrapped trellises and brittle lawn edges. The musicians glance skyward, uncertain whether to keep playing or protect their violins. Somewhere behind the hedges, A maid is quietly moving sponge cake trays indoors with the determined panic of someone who's seen this exact weather pattern ruin 3 currant puddings in 1 week. Rain is coming. And with it, Rule 11, rain changes everything. Oh, the choreography of a Victorian garden party was delicate enough when the sun was shining. Add in moisture, and the entire affair shifts from elegant flirtation to mildly theatrical disaster with a high chance of engagement. Because when the sky opens, so too does social flexibility. Boundaries soften. Parasols change purpose. Gloves get wet, hems get muddy, and perhaps most importantly, umbrellas must be shared. Now, sharing an umbrella was not a simple act of shelter. It was intimate. It was impromptu. It was, in some cases, destiny. You see, when a gentleman offers his umbrella to a lady, or vice versa, yes, there were bold ladies in these parts, he's offering more than dry shoulders. He's offering proximity. A space where words can be whispered without chaperones. Where the lace of a bonnet might brush his cheek. Where raindrops create a soundscape so soothing it practically demands vulnerability. But let's back up. You feel the first drop now, a soft, almost apologetic tap against your glove. Then another. And another. All around you, guests respond in a carefully orchestrated spectrum of alarm. Gasps, delicate squeals, one dramatic feint, possibly unrelated, and a surge toward the nearest covered areas. You do not run. Running is for commoners and geese. Instead, you turn, casually, and spot Lydia. Her gaze meets yours as if to say, well, what now? You offer your umbrella, which until this moment has been purely decorative and aggressively floral. She hesitates just long enough to make you doubt yourself, then accepts with a smile that nearly breaks the social fabric. And just like that, you're walking side by side beneath embroidered oilcloth, weaving between puddles and gasping guests. The path curves through an arbor. The rain begins in earnest. This is where things get interesting. Historians still debate whether rainy day flirtation was more effective due to the reduced supervision, the natural romantic backdrop, or the sheer number of soaked garments that required drying assistance. Regardless, one thing is clear: rain rewrote the script. Consider this: you are now walking close enough to brush sleeves. That's physical contact, folks. Not the scandalous kind, mind you, but the kind that sends whispers fluttering through a row of shawled onlookers like pigeons startled by a cannon. And there's something about rain that slows time. Maybe it's the patter. Maybe it's the gray light. Maybe it's that everyone becomes a bit softer, a bit more themselves. Umbrella conversations weren't about grand declarations. They were about odd little truths. Like, I never liked marzipan. I once mistook a geranium for a radish and bit it. My cousin believes bees understand Latin. Tiny truths. Low-stakes revelations. These, oddly enough, were how affection bloomed. The pressure of ballroom conversation, gone. The scrutiny of parasol angles, washed away. Rain was an equalizer. Wet boots don't care about your lineage. Lydia, no more than one mention, stays sharp, laughs gently as a droplet makes its way from the umbrella's edge onto your hat. It splashes. You both look up. The rain, now, is falling in earnest, enough that you know this won't be a 5-minute sprinkle. This is a situation. Nearby, 2 other guests are sharing an umbrella. One couple crouches beneath a linen tablecloth, huddled and blushing. A lady is attempting to shield her dog with a silver tray. The pianist is sprinting toward the house holding a cello over his head. It's chaos, genteel style. You, however, are calm. After all, this is your moment. You guide Lydia toward the garden folly, an overgrown structure meant to resemble a Roman ruin, but mostly used to store folding chairs and wasp nests. Inside, it's dry. Barely. And quiet. She steps in beside you, adjusting her shawl. You're standing now in a pocket of solitude, framed by vines and drizzle. The world outside sounds muffled. Inside, every breath feels louder. This wasn't in the program, she says, brushing a drop from her cheek. You shrug. Some of the best parts never are. See that? That's an unscripted line. Not rehearsed. not borrowed from a book of Byron's lesser poems. Yours. You're officially improvising inside a garden ruin during a rainstorm with a woman who accepted your umbrella. This, in Victorian courtship terms, is dangerously close to cinematic. And then, you hear it. The call of the chaperone. A distant, unmistakable LYYYY drawn out like a church bell falling downstairs. It's Aunt something or other. The one who smells faintly of lavender and disapproval. You straighten. Lydia lifts an eyebrow. She doesn't move. And here's the decision point. Do you suggest staying just a moment longer? Do you imply rebellion? Or do you bow, literally and figuratively, and let the moment close with grace? You choose the bow. Gracefully. And as you step aside to let her pass, she pauses and murmurs, just loud enough to rise above the rain. I think I do like marzipan, actually. That, dear listener, is a callback. And in the grand game of flirtation, a callback is a victory. Rain, after all, has its own etiquette. You must be bold enough to act, but subtle enough to retreat. Sharing an umbrella is not a declaration of eternal affection, but it is a scene. And scenes, in this society, were often remembered far longer than words. By the time the guests begin to reassemble, clothes damp, hats askew, spirits high, the air is changed. The formalities are a bit looser. Gloves are spotted. Cake is soggy. And yet, beneath it all, the buzz of conversation grows louder. Did you see who ran under the gazebo with Mr. Hemsley? I heard she gave up her shawl to cover a violin. I'm certain those two were inside the folly for 12 whole minutes. Rain has made you part of the story. And Lydia? She's returned to her group, unbothered, cheeks flushed. She glances your way only once, quickly. But that's enough. So, here's your lesson, don't fear the rain. In a world of rehearsed lines and practiced smiles, it's the unplanned moments, soggy, shared, slightly ridiculous, that build real connection. And maybe, just maybe, you'll be the one talked about over the fire later. Now dry your sleeves, fix your collar, and prepare yourself. Because we're about to enter dangerous territory. Ankles. You're damp but dignified. The rain has passed like a theater curtain drawing back after an intermission, revealing a refreshed garden, guests slightly tousled, and conversation now delightfully relaxed. There's a new ease in the air, the kind only achievable after communal mild discomfort, and a shared fear that someone's bonnet glue might fail under pressure. And now comes a perilous moment. You are engaged in small talk with a pleasant young woman, not Lydia, not yet, and the conversation is rolling along smoothly. You've touched on weather, tea strength, and whether violets or hyacinths make a better border plant. You feel emboldened. And you say it. And some say ankles are the first to suffer in a storm like that. Silence. She blinks. Another guest nearby turns slightly, just enough to catch the scent of scandal. Someone coughs into a handkerchief, pointedly. And just like that, you've crossed the line. Rule 12, never mention ankles first. Oh, ankles. The final frontier of Victorian flirtation. An area of the body so simultaneously mundane and provocative that it could destroy a dinner party faster than an undercooked meringue. You may be wondering, why ankles? Why would something so plainly biological hold such weight? Historians still argue about this. Some say the fascination with ankles arose from the simple fact that they were rarely seen. Skirts brushed the ground. Stockings were thick and often hand-mended. Petticoats layered like geological strata. An accidental glimpse of an ankle could send someone into a full internal operatic aria. Others believe the obsession was more symbolic. Ankles marked the edge of modesty, the boundary between visible and forbidden. Regardless of origin, one truth remains: in mixed company, mentioning ankles was a social live wire. Especially if you brought them up first. Now, this doesn't mean ankles were never discussed. On the contrary, they were the subject of entire medical pamphlets, shoemaking guides, and a handful of deeply unwholesome poems. But in public, and particularly in flirtation, the key was context and permission. There were appropriate routes into the topic. If a lady herself remarked, I fear I twisted something during the dance. You were allowed to inquire delicately after her foot. Not her ankle, her foot. If a chaperone remarked that the grass was slippery, a neutral nod about unfortunate footwear was allowed. If a dog attempted to bite someone's boot, you could express concern about the heel, and possibly, glance at the ankle from the corner of your eye. But to lead with it? To reference the ankle without invitation? You may as well shout kneecaps in a church. This was a world where body talk was reserved for doctors, tailors, and the sort of cousin who lived abroad and sent back peculiar postcards. Flirtation, remember, operated on metaphors and subtext. You were expected to talk around a topic, to circle it politely like a hawk around a hedgerow. If you admired a lady's posture, you were admiring her ankles. If you complimented the way she stepped into a carriage, you were flirting with disaster. The best compliments were about stability, grace, direction. Anything more specific, and you'd find yourself redirected, swiftly, to the fruit tart table by an unimpressed aunt. You're now recovering from your faux pas. The young lady smiles thinly, and says, "Yes, I suppose feet do suffer so," before turning to adjust her bonnet with the air of someone sealing a vault. You're not ruined. But you've been marked. Let this be a lesson. Bodily admiration must be cloaked in innocent observation. Consider the following safe topics and their flirtation equivalents. You walk with great purpose equals I have noticed your lower limbs. That's a particularly well-made boot equals I find your feet elegant and possibly arousing. You seem unbothered by uneven ground equals I admire your strength and balance, and would follow you into any hedge maze. This was how you showed affection without offending. You suggested ankles. You never named them. Take the case of Frederick Whistleburn, who once complimented a lady's well-turned heel during a poetry recital. She fainted, the pianist stopped playing, and his name was scrubbed from the next 3 event rosters. And no one even asked if the heel was well turned. Contrast this with Lady Milton, who once wore soft lavender boots with a tiny brass buckle. A gentleman admired their craftsmanship. She smiled. They were married the following year. The boots were mentioned in the vows. So yes, boots and shoes were acceptable proxy topics. A gentleman might note the color, the shine, even the lace, but only if done with an air of academic curiosity. You, meanwhile, are wisely returning to safer conversational shores. Something about the resilience of begonias. Good. You're learning. But if you're still tempted, here's a trick. Use a turnip. Yes, a turnip. Victorians loved metaphor, especially botanical ones. If you feel drawn to compliment someone's general physical composition, redirect it through the lens of vegetable admiration. She walks with the surety of someone who's planted root vegetables in all weather. Your steadiness on the lawn reminds me of a turnip resisting late frost. Absurd? Absolutely. But also oddly effective. If delivered with a wink, just kidding, no winking, or a gentle smile, it becomes flirtation by satire. And if the lady laughs? You've just made her complicit in the joke. You might be surprised how many marriages began with vegetable metaphors. There's even a family in Devon who claim descent from a man who once said, "Your spirit is as grounded as a parsnip." They're still happily married, several generations in. So now you know. The ankle is a dangerous but powerful territory. If crossed respectfully, it can ignite subtle attraction. If mishandled, it invites exile, or worse, a condescending headshake from someone holding a lace-trimmed handkerchief. As you step away from your conversational near-miss, you spot Lydia again. She's beside the croquet set, speaking with someone suspiciously peacock-like in a waistcoat that seems to reflect more sunlight than fabric should. You approach slowly, safely, your conversation weaponry now refined. No ankles. Only turnips. Only grace. And croquet? Well, that's a game where people swing mallets under emotional duress. Get ready. The sun, having done its part with the rain, and then a few well-placed beams for dramatic effect, now casts a warm glow across the lawn. Birds are chirping again, just a little too loudly, if you ask the flautist who's trying to resume background music with some dignity, and everything feels freshly rearranged. And there they are, 2 hoops, 6 mallets, for wickets, and at least 3 strained smiles. Rule 13. Leave before the peacocks cry. Now I know what you're thinking, peacocks? Crying? Isn't that poetic? No. It's quite literal. At many estate garden parties in the mid-1800s, peacocks were not uncommon. Lord Elveston kept 6. One once chased a parson into a pond. Their cries, high-pitched and abrupt, marked the tipping point of any respectable event, when flirtation gave way to fatigue, when mystery curdled into obligation. In short, if the peacocks are screaming, you've overstayed. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For now, you're observing a croquet match. Croquet, in theory, is an innocent game involving mallets, gentle taps, and strategic positioning of colored balls. But in practice, especially at a Victorian garden party, it is a minefield of innuendo, hidden rivalries, and barely concealed emotional outbursts. This is no game for the faint of heart. You watch Lydia step up to the ball. She holds the mallet with poise, if not experience. Her opponent, a gentleman with more cravat than sense, offers unnecessary guidance. Just swing as though you're tossing away a dreadful suitor. She smiles thinly. The mallet swings. The ball rolls with alarming precision. It barely nudges his into an awkward position near a hedge. It's an accident, of course. She's very apologetic. You sip your drink and file the move under absolutely intentional. Croquet, after all, is where garden flirtation turns competitive. There are no dances to mask foot placement, no fans to flutter in retreat. You are standing on open grass, gripping a club, and being quietly judged by everyone, including the vicar pretending to read about dahlias in the corner. Now you are invited to play. Politely, of course. A casual, "Will you join us?" from Lydia and an encouraging nod from a woman with earrings shaped like strawberries. How could you refuse? You take up your mallet, adopt the appropriate expression, determined, but not too eager, and approach your ball. Historians still debate whether croquet's sudden rise in popularity was due to its accessibility, its resemblance to strategic military planning, or its startling ability to stir romantic tension. Some even suggest croquet was invented to allow unmarried people to bend at the waist in public with plausible deniability. Whether true or not, it works. The moment you lean down to line up your shot, you're aware of several things. Your collar is slightly askew. Someone behind you is whispering, hopefully about your stance, not your lineage. Lydia is standing just out of reach, hands folded, observing. You strike. The ball sails, not wildly, but not exactly gracefully either. It arcs toward the wicket and stops. 2 inches short. You straighten. Someone makes a sound that is either sympathy or poorly disguised amusement. Lydia gives you that look, the one people reserve for good dogs and second-best puddings. But you smile. Because here's the secret to croquet courtship: the score doesn't matter. What matters is how you play. Gentle encouragement, artful teasing, mild sabotage. These are the cornerstones of emotional depth. Take Miss Eleanor Breck, who once gently nudged a rival's ball out of bounds and then offered her handkerchief in apology. They were engaged by September. Contrast this with Sir Thomas Pinefield, who once bragged so loudly about his 3-stroke win that he was immediately doused in lemonade by a child no one could identify. You, wisely, keep it simple. Ah well, you say, dusting your sleeve. A bit of suspense adds to the charm. Lydia, smiling, steps up for her next turn. This time, she misses, just barely, and pretends to be disappointed. It's a pattern now. You miss, she misses. You land a decent shot, she matches it. Back and forth, a gentle game layered with subtle admiration. But then, the peacocks. The cry cuts through the garden like an operatic scream into a glass of claret. Sharp. Unapologetic. A sound no one can quite explain but everyone recognizes. And now, everything changes. It's the unspoken sign. The moment at which guests begin to collect shawls, adjust bonnets, and glance toward carriages with the kind of melancholy only British people can summon when ending something that involved pastries. You glance at Lydia. She hears it too. Everyone hears it. It's the garden party equivalent of the final bell. This is your moment, not to linger, not to drag the afternoon into tea-stained awkwardness, but to leave well. Victorians prize the graceful exit. A sudden departure? Too abrupt. A long, meandering goodbye? Exhausting. You want to vanish in a way that leaves people wondering where you went, and why they already miss you. You offer Lydia a bow, not too deep, not too shallow. I do hope the roses recover before morning, you say? It's nonsense. But elegant nonsense. The kind of line that means everything and nothing. She smiles. Perhaps they'll remember the dance more fondly than we do. You both turn, separately. She rejoins her chaperone, who has been watching from a respectable distance while drinking something that appears to be rhubarb cordial. You drift toward the path. As you walk, the garden shifts behind you. The croquet mallets are stacked. The cake is mostly gone. The gossip lingers in corners like perfume. And the peacocks, somewhere in the distance, cry again. Which means you've done it right. Leaving before the peacocks cry too many times means leaving while the memory of your presence is still bathed in sunlight and possibility. It's the key to ensuring that your flirtation, whether it becomes a romance, a rumor, or a dream, remains intact. You pass under the garden's main arch, trailing damp grass and a conversation you didn't quite finish. But that's the point. Unfinished conversations are seeds. They grow. They're remembered. And somewhere, maybe right now, someone is whispering to someone else. You saw them near the folly, right before the rain? No, by the rose arbor. They were laughing about turnips? Really? I heard they shared an umbrella. For minutes. You don't correct them. You just keep walking slowly. Before the peacocks cry a third time. You've slipped out from under the gaze of lace-trimmed judgment, skirted scandal, and departed with a reputation so delicately burnished it practically glows. And yet, while you sipped lemonade and avoided mentioning ankles, another world churned beneath the surface, silent, efficient, indispensable. It's time to peek behind the curtain. Rule 14. Unofficial: the secret world of garden party staff. Ah yes. The butlers, the maids, the footmen who materialize with a second fork just as yours clattered to the lawn. The gardeners who trimmed the hedges so perfectly that they somehow herded guests into photogenic clusters without a single word. The kitchen staff who knew that cold roast lamb could only be served if precisely 3 sprigs of parsley were sacrificed in its name. You may have flirted, dear listener, but they orchestrated the stage. Let's begin with the most visible, the butler. At a large estate, the head butler was both commander and conductor. He managed staff movement with the precision of a chess master, and the expression of someone who hadn't genuinely smiled since the coronation of Queen Charlotte. His duties included ensuring the lemonade didn't sour, the scones weren't fatal, and that no one of questionable lineage got too close to the good china. If you noticed, say, a parasol conveniently left near the rose trellis just before you and Lydia arrived, that wasn't coincidence. That was Harold. Harold is the kind of butler who hears things before they're spoken, who sees a fan flick and correctly interprets it not as flirtation, but as a guest's subtle signal for the raspberry tart was underwhelming. He moves unseen, unheard, yet always present, like a bow tie with sentience. Then we have the maids. Often overlooked in social accounts, these were the silent architects of comfort. Did the garden chairs appear freshly dusted despite the breeze? That was Hattie. Did the floral arrangements match both the season and the subtext of the party's underlying political allegiances? That was probably Eliza. Maids also possessed the most valuable resource of all, information. If someone needed to know who had been seen in the folly with whom, or which guest suffered a wardrobe malfunction involving an overly eager bird and a button loop, a clever maid already knew, and possibly helped orchestrate it. Some even had favorites. If a guest treated them kindly, complimented their tray handling, or didn't loudly express confusion over which fork was for asparagus, it's always the leftmost one. By the way, they might find themselves subtly aided. A timely refill. A warning about an incoming ant. A delay in the string quartet restarting just long enough for a private exchange to finish. Victorians loved rules, but the staff knew when to bend them for effect. Now, consider the footmen. Beautifully dressed, standing like furniture with opinions, and often tasked with delivering tiny food items that barely qualified as edible, these young men were the garden party's courier system. They were the human equivalent of love notes on legs. Did someone receive a slightly chilled cordial at the exact moment their cheeks flushed during conversation? That was intentional. Footmen were taught to recognize the signs of mild social overheating. There's even a documented case, in a household diary, mind you, of a footman discreetly stepping on a loose corner of a guest's train to delay her movement just long enough for her to hear a compliment she wasn't supposed to overhear. That footman later became a stage actor. Obviously. Then, we mustn't forget the gardeners. While less visible during the actual party, they were the unseen magicians who created the backdrop. Those rose bushes you so dramatically stood near? Groomed at dawn. The stone walk you glided down during your umbrella moment? Sanded, rinsed, and quietly cursed over the night before. Some gardeners even participated during the party, disguised as casual groundskeepers pruning things that didn't need pruning. Why? Because when you're holding a pair of shears and standing near a hedge, no one notices you listening. And finally, the kitchen staff. The quiet heroes. The ones who understood that the entire social balance of an afternoon could be destroyed by a too wobbly jelly or a lukewarm cream pot. They worked in heat, in haste, and in relative anonymity, and yet they were the pulse of the affair. Let us take a moment to honor Mildred, who once, when asked by a frantic aunt if there were any gluten-free sponges, responded with, "Only those made of air and regret," and still somehow kept her job. Now, why does this matter for flirtation? Because the staff, not the guests, often held the keys to timing. Want a moment alone? Hope a maid distracts a chaperone. Need a conversation delayed? Pray a butler misdirects a guest with a sudden concern about napkin symmetry. Wish for one more glimpse of someone before departure? Hope a footman drops a hatbox in their path. All the elegance you experienced was curated. And this adds a fascinating layer. The staff were not only witnesses but sometimes co-conspirators. Quiet allies. They saw which parasol twirls were genuine and which were for show. They knew who loved whom, who didn't, and who brought store-bought jam in a homemade jar. They also judged, silently but efficiently. Those who shouted across the lawn, ridiculed in the pantry. Those who treated footmen like table legs, assigned the slightly off scones. Those who flirted with sincerity and charm, given a little extra time, a little extra space, and occasionally, a better view of the person they just danced with. So next time you find yourself attending an event, perhaps modern, perhaps not, pause and remember the ones moving behind the scenes. Not just for etiquette's sake, but because sometimes they are the ones who make flirtation possible. Now your shoes are drying, your fan is folded, and the sun is low. But we're not done yet. Because next come the aunties. And they never forget. If you think you're in control of your fate here, just because you dance well, handled rain with grace, and spoke of root vegetables at exactly the right emotional volume, allow me to introduce you to the true puppet masters of the Victorian garden party. Rule 15. But really, always how aunties controlled the game. Yes. The aunties. They drift through the party in respectable shades of lavender and mauve, trailing perfumes best described as botanical persistence. They carry reticules the size of emotional baggage, and their smiles are kind, practiced, and, when necessary, deadly. You may think they're just here to admire rhododendrons and complain about the marrow in the soup. But no. The aunties are here to manage. And you, dear listener, are absolutely on their ledger. Let's clarify terms. The auntie isn't always a biological aunt. Sometimes she's a family friend, a godmother, a widowed cousin who refuses to remarry because, in her words, one husband is enough of a curiosity. Sometimes she's a dowager whose reputation is more varnished than a piano stool. But all of them share the same sacred role. They are the social guardians of flirtation's boundaries. And within those boundaries they rule. You may have felt their presence already, hovering just near enough to the rose arbor to ruin a moment, seated at the edge of the dance lawn with suspiciously good hearing, or lurking near the sponge cake table pretending to care about the butter ratio while actually tracking every eye glance between you and Lydia. One name per section, as always. Historians still argue whether Victorian aunties operated under a shared code or whether they simply absorbed the power structure through osmosis. What is certain is that they were nearly impossible to deceive, and absolutely impossible to ignore. There are, broadly speaking, 3 types of aunties. The matchmaker auntie. This one wants you to succeed, but only on her terms. She's constantly nudging guests into proximity, saying things like, "Why don't you help Miss Feathercombe choose a biscuit?" Or "I think you and Mr. Ellery share a fondness for organ music." She sets the table for romance, and then steps back, watching, recording, evaluating. She will absolutely repeat every word you say later, usually with added interpretation and dramatic flair. The gatekeeper auntie. The defensive wall of propriety. She's the one who catches Lydia's eye during your umbrella moment, and blinks in Morse code for distance, now. She inserts herself into conversations mid-sentence, and suddenly has questions about your lineage, your intentions, and whether your posture indicates moral laxity. You must charm her, but never try to outwit her. She has raised 5 sons, outlived 2 husbands, and once silenced a viscount with a single eyebrow twitch. The rogue auntie. Unpredictable. Dangerous. Delightful. She drinks sherry before the party starts, flirts with younger guests just to stir the waters, and loudly tells stories about her time in Vienna as though everyone understands the euphemisms. She might help you. She might not. Either way, she will make the afternoon memorable. Right now, as you stand sipping lukewarm punch near the honeysuckle hedge, you spot at least 2 aunties triangulating. One pretends to rearrange her shawl. Another inspects a fallen petal on the grass far too intently. You are being observed. Evaluated. Catalogued like a painting at a charity auction. So, how do you survive? With careful doses of performance. You do not retreat. That shows guilt. You do not preen. That shows desperation. You continue as you are, with just a touch more decorum. Speak clearly. Reference a book, but not one too obscure. Offer a compliment to another guest that has absolutely no romantic subtext. And crucially, include an auntie in your orbit. Not obviously. That's suspicious. But casually. Ask her a question about flowers. Offer her a chair. Laugh, gently, at one of her stories, even if it ends with the phrase "and that's why we never trust a Danish man with a telescope." By acknowledging the aunties, you both honor their role and defuse their suspicion. You're no longer a rogue suitor. You're a charming guest who knows the value of a well-aged opinion. Now, for those truly daring, there is one advanced maneuver, the anti-confessional. This is where you, gently and with complete sincerity, admit to an emotional vulnerability within their earshot. Something tasteful. Like, "I fear I am hopeless at croquet, but I do enjoy the rhythm of it." Or, "I confess I find these garden parties overwhelming, though that folly did feel like a quiet haven." If delivered correctly, the auntie may reassess you as a person of sensitivity. She may even, though this is rare, drop a comment like, "You know, Miss Feathercombe rather enjoys the folly too." That, my dear, is practically matchmaking consent. There is one exception: do not attempt to befriend all aunties. Choose wisely. Too much charm, too widely deployed, and you become insincere. Worse, a flirt. Worst of all, a musician. Let's reflect briefly on one infamous case. Young Percival Thatch once complimented 5 different aunties in one afternoon. He remembered their nieces' names. He offered them fruit. He made one laugh. By nightfall, he was labeled ambitious, possibly French, and very good at backgammon, but what does that really mean? He left the party alone and permanently banned from rhubarb cordial. So, back to you. You've now survived a gaze, a nod, and a muttered comment from a nearby auntie. She adjusts her bonnet. She rises, slowly, and wanders away. Not out of disapproval, but because she has enough data for now. You've passed. And somewhere, Lydia, there's our name again, meets your gaze with the faintest hint of amusement. Because she knows the aunties are watching. She's grown up under their rule. And she just saw you survive them with your dignity and your potential intact. You bow slightly. Not to her. To the moment. Because every garden party is part courtship, part stage play, and part emotional chess game with floral pieces. And behind all of it, the aunties move silently, enforcing the rules. You may have danced with a lady. You may have braved the rain. But only now, after passing through the aunties, are you truly a contender. Next, we arm you with a mallet. Because croquet is coming back. And this time, it's personal. You've endured rain, gossip, rose-scented innuendo, and the inquisitorial gaze of 3 different aunties with 3 slightly different monocles. You've been vetted, assessed, quietly debated over sponge cake crumbs, and somehow deemed acceptable. Now, it's time to step once more onto the greenest battlefield in the Victorian flirtation theater. Rule 16, the misuse of lawn games. Yes. We return to croquet. But this time, it's no mere icebreaker or breezy post-pudding diversion. The light has changed, lower now, a buttery gold brushing across the hedges, and the air hums with the peculiar tension of early evening, the time when flirtation grows bolder and social risk seems slightly less terrifying. This round is not about winning. It's about how you play. You arrive at the lawn to find the mallets already laid out. Guests gather again, many still damp-hemmed and rain-frizzed, but with spirits buoyed by lemonade and veiled commentary. Lydia is already there. Yes, we're still abiding by our one name per section protocol. She leans on a mallet, her posture casual, but her expression one of keen observation. She's waiting. Not necessarily for you, but not for you either. And just behind her stands a new player, someone with a waistcoat so bright it may be visible from the moon, laughing too loudly at jokes no one is telling. We shall call him Reginald. There's always a Reginald. You retrieve a mallet of your own. Not too worn. Not too polished. The kind that suggests you know what to do with it, but don't bring your own monogrammed set to parties. That was a thing. They called it serious. Others called it unspeakable. Now let's examine the flirtational potential and peril of Victorian lawn games. On the surface, games like croquet, lawn bowls, or even the occasionally revived shuttlecock duel, don't ask, were mere amusements. But beneath their quaint surface lay a minefield of coded intentions. Why? Because the format permitted what normal conversation could not. Proximity. Teasing. Competitive banter that masked emotional exploration. You see, a person might not be allowed to compliment your eyes directly, but they could comment on your stance while lining up a shot. You might not be permitted to touch someone's hand, but you could adjust their grip on the mallet. Social constraints became just bendy enough for flirtation to slip through like sunbeams under a parasol. Historians still argue whether these games were intentionally designed for flirtation or simply co-opted over time. Some believe Queen Victoria herself frowned upon croquet as encouraging unnecessary frivolity. Others say she once lost a match to Prince Albert and sulked for a full week. Sources are unclear. Either way, croquet became the slowest duel of affection known to Victorian society. You're up. First turn. You step forward, tap your ball gently. It rolls. Clean. Controlled. Enough to show intention, not ego. Lydia's turn. She sets her stance, glances sideways, not at you of course, but in your direction. The ball rolls true, landing near yours. Reginald steps up. He's the sort who swings like he's trying to impress a cavalry regiment. His ball clatters, overshoots, and very nearly collides with a footman, who catches it mid-bounce with the reflexes of a cricket god and the expression of a bored goat. Aha! Reginald bellows. Bit of excitement. The garden politely ignores him. Now, this is where strategy comes in. Your next turn gives you an opportunity. You could advance toward the wicket and take the lead. Or you could subtly nudge Lydia's ball, aligning her for a better position. This is the classic courtship move in lawn games, the assist. You approach, glance briefly at her, and say, "Mind if I lend a tap in your favor?" She tilts her head, almost smiles. "If it's accidental, I'm not responsible." You nod, take aim, and gently nudge her ball forward, perfect alignment for the next hoop. It's subtle, clean, and just self-effacing enough to be charming. "Well done," she says, turning to prepare. "What you've just done is more than a polite gesture. It's a proposal of mutual effort. A sign that you're not just playing for yourself. And it's being noticed." Around you, other pairs engage in similar theater. One gentleman purposefully forgets how to hold the mallet. A young lady offers correction, her gloved hand over his. Somewhere near the raspberry bush, someone loudly accuses their partner of malicious misalignment, which likely means they've been flirting aggressively for the past half hour. But here's the danger. Games like croquet allow for a flirtation style known as the competitive collapse, where one or both players, swept up in rivalry, abandon charm in favor of strategy. This is a mistake. You must never try too hard to win. The perfect garden suitor plays well enough to be respected, but never so well as to crush another's hopes. You let Reginald win the second round, he needed it. You smile when he over-celebrates. You maintain a quiet confidence. And in the third round, you and Lydia make an unspoken alliance. Each turn flows into the next. You aim for the same wicket. You share glances. Once your mallets brush handles as you step into formation. You're no longer playing the game. You've become the game. Just when the match seems destined to end, a final twist. Lydia's ball rests against the final hoop. Your turn. If you strike true, you win, not just the game, but both of you do. If you miss, the moment's tension remains, delightfully unresolved. You line up. Breathe. Tap. The ball rolls. Slows. Touches the hoop. And stops. You glance sideways. She says nothing. She doesn't have to. Because sometimes, losing is winning. The game concludes. There's applause, polite, restrained, full of interpretation. Reginald is drinking something out of a shell-shaped cup. The sky darkens. The peacocks are, mercifully, asleep. You step back from the croquet lawn with grass on your shoes and something far warmer in your chest. You didn't win. But you played beautifully. And tonight, in the retellings around fireplaces and embroidery circles, the match will be remembered, not for the score, but for the way two people shared a mallet handle. That, dear listener, is Victorian romance at its most dangerous, mildly competitive, beautifully indirect, and entirely unforgettable. The croquet lawn fades behind you now, its mallets line neatly like exhausted soldiers, its final glances exchanged under the camouflage of polite farewells. Your boots are stained with dignity and a trace of elderflower, and as you wander toward the quieter paths of the garden, you sense the tempo of the afternoon beginning to slow. But you're not done yet. Because if you've come this far, through rain and roses and rose-colored rumors, then you must now face the softest, strangest, and most fragrant battlefield of all. Rule 17, Flowers, Codes, and the Dangers of Daisies. To flirt at a Victorian garden party without knowing the language of flowers is like trying to write poetry without verbs. You might get by on adjectives alone, but don't expect anyone to swoon. You see, Victorians weren't just obsessed with flowers for their scent or aesthetic. They spoke through them, using bouquets the way we use text messages today. A sprig of thyme could say "I admire your courage," while a violet might whisper "I'll always be watching, even if I pretend I'm not." This elaborate language, floriography, for the enthusiasts among you, was chronicled in dozens of best-selling books with titles like The Sentimental Botanist's Almanac and A Lady's Pocket Posy Dictionary. There were charts, cross-references, entire debates about whether a marigold signified grief or simply an upset stomach. And within this chaos bloomed flirtation's most delicate tool, the garden bouquet. Guests would stroll the party snipping flowers, not the prized ones, of course, but the casually accessible blooms along paths and fences. They'd collect a few, arrange them absent-mindedly, and, whether they admitted it or not, send messages with every petal. You find yourself beside a basket of loosely gathered cuttings. There are marjoram sprigs, tiny forget-me-nots, pansies with slightly crooked faces, and one daisy that looks like it's just realized it's not the main character. Lydia approaches. Her bouquet is small but deliberate. Lavender. White rose. One shy buttercup peeking from the side like a debutante with social anxiety. She doesn't hand it to you. She just walks near. That's how these things start. Now, if you were trained in floriography, you'd know. Lavender equals devotion, or sometimes I'm thinking of you, but from a safe and entirely defensible distance. White rose equals purity or silence. A classic. Buttercup equals childish joy, with a subtle undertone of don't underestimate me. What's dangerous is that every flower has multiple meanings. A single petal's interpretation could shift depending on the mood, the time of day, or whether someone last saw it in a funeral arrangement. Take the daisy. Sweet, innocent, approachable. Except when it's not. In one floriography guide, a daisy means loyal love. In another, I will tell no one. And in a third, published anonymously and sold in brown wrappers, I have seen you remove your gloves, and I'm still thinking about it. You select a flower now. Something low stakes. A sprig of rosemary. Traditionally, remembrance. But if paired with anything in yellow, it becomes I remember, and I resent. You hand it to her, not directly. You simply leave it on the bench near where she's standing. She notices, of course. But she doesn't look up. Instead, she plucks a tiny purple bloom, heliotrope, and sets it beside yours. Heliotrope means eternal love or devotion, depending on the florist. But also, I hope you aren't allergic. This is how it begins. Soon your bouquet begins to take shape. Not as a gift, not as a symbol, but as a conversation. You add a sprig of thyme. Courage. She adds honeysuckle. Devoted affection. Or, possibly, this party is getting interesting. You pause. Nearby, a young man is presenting a girl with a full carnation, which is frankly reckless. Carnations are the loose cannons of floriography. Red means love. White means pure affection. Stripe means I can never love you, which is not ideal before the jelly is served. The girl accepts it. She blinks twice. It's unclear which meaning she chooses to believe. That's the danger. Now back to you. You've reached the final flourish. The bouquet is balanced, rich in tone and subtext. One final flower will seal the message. You choose the bluebell. A perfect bloom for this moment. It means humility, constancy, or I'd follow you through at least 3 more rainstorms without needing to clarify my feelings aloud. You place it gently on the bench. Lydia steps forward, adjusts the arrangement, just slightly. She adds a bloom so small you almost miss it, a violet. Shyness. Watchfulness. I will speak when I'm ready. And there it is, the entire narrative, wordless but unmistakable. Now understand this. Most guests do not know the complete language of flowers. Most are guessing. Many have simply picked what looks pretty. But the act of guessing, of trying, is itself romantic. Historians have noted that flower codes were often less about the actual meaning and more about the interpretive performance. It wasn't about being right. It was about having the courage to speak symbolically. After all, when you present someone with a rose, what matters more? That you know its Victorian meaning, or that you wanted to say something that felt beautiful and brief? Of course, misunderstandings abound. In one diary entry from 1866, a gentleman sent a posy of white lilies to a lady as a gesture of respect. She interpreted it as a morning bouquet and wore black for 3 days. They eventually cleared things up, but not before a cousin gave a eulogy out of an abundance of caution. So when you offer your bouquet, and Lydia accepts it, with a nod, not a smile, which is even better, know that you have done something both risky and refined. You've said I see you. I have noticed. I will not rush. But here is my version of poetry, grown from soil and suspicion. That, dear listener, is the essence of Victorian flirtation. And as the last rays of sunlight stretch across the grass, as guests gather their shawls and begin discussing transport options, someone will notice the two of you parting ways. Not hand in hand. Not yet. But each holding a bouquet made of secrets. The garden is shifting again. You feel it beneath your feet, not a literal tremor, but the subtle movement of energy. The way conversations shorten, laughs grow quieter, and guests begin to speak in past tense. That was a lovely punch. Weren't the hydrangeas luminous just before the rain? But just when you expect the slow slide into farewells and carriage etiquette, the unexpected arrives. Rule 18. What to do when a secret is mistakenly shared. You're standing by the stone urn near the east lawn, where the view of the orchard always makes guests a little more philosophical, when you hear it. Two ladies, drifting past in hushed conversation, not seeing you in the dappled light. Well, if she hadn't been caught with Mr. Bellamy in the pantry, perhaps her fichu wouldn't be wrinkled. Did you see how she offered him that pear tart? Like it meant something. You freeze. Not because of the gossip itself. This is a garden party, not a monastery, but because of one small, dangerous word tucked into that statement. Caught. Someone was caught. In a pantry. With a gentleman. During the sponge cake window. Now you're not one for scandal. But you are for stories. And if this story unfolds correctly, it might just help. Because while flirtation thrives on suggestion, a well-timed secret, especially one partially misunderstood, can do what two dances and a complimentary herb posy never could. You remain still. The ladies float past, their parasols tilted in passive judgment, their information left hanging like wet laundry on a Monday. And then you spot her. Lydia. She's a few feet away, arranging her bouquet again, possibly to extend the moment, or possibly to avoid her aunt's third call toward the carriage. Either way, she looks up and sees you. You nod. A little too slowly. The kind of nod that implies you've heard something. Because you have. But here's the tricky part, you don't know the full truth. Was it Lydia in the pantry? Doubtful. She's not a pantry type. The carpet alone would give her allergies. But someone, somewhere, has crossed a boundary, real or perceived, and now the narrative is loose in the wild. Victorian society was nothing if not susceptible to inference. And that was the danger of flirtation in such carefully staged surroundings. One glance, one pause too long at the biscuit table, one bit of parsley clinging to a cuff, and your entire afternoon could be rewritten. So, what do? You walk, casually, toward Lydia, who's placing a single pansy into the bouquet. Symbolic of thinking of you, in case you forgot. She's good. You don't reference what you heard. That would be vulgar. Instead, you say, it's remarkable how quickly fiction blooms in a garden like this. She doesn't smile, exactly. But something behind her eyes flickers. Interest? Amusement? Relief? She replies, that depends. Are you referring to the roses or the rumors? Touché. You're now engaged in a coded conversation, the kind where meaning must hide in plain sight. You must keep the dialogue as layered and as polite as a millefeuille. No accusation. No presumption. I find both often conceal thorns, you say. She glances at her bouquet. Then perhaps we ought to be careful how we gather them. Is it about the flowers? Is it about the pantry? Yes. Now, for a brief moment, the conversation hangs on a precipice. She could walk away. She could ask what you heard. She could mention the pantry. But she doesn't. Instead, she adjusts a ribbon on her bouquet and asks, did you enjoy the game? Ah. We are redirecting. This is a sign. A boundary has been set. And boundaries, in Victorian courtship, were not merely emotional, they were moral topography. They told you where you might linger, and where you'd best offer a polite retreat. So you play along. I did. Even if I missed the final wicket. A pause. Then, sometimes it's better not to win. Winning reveals too much. Now that is a line worth engraving. Historians still argue whether Victorian flirtation was an art of suggestion or a game of secrets. But the truth, dear listener, is that it was both. The very best moments were the ones where either party said exactly what they meant, yet both left the exchange with hearts slightly rearranged. You turn the conversation back to safer ground. The weather. The way the sun now glints off the brass urn. The oddly delightful noise the peacocks made earlier, somewhere between a trumpet and a sneeze. But underneath it all, a new thread has been sewn. She knows you know. And you know she knows you know. What neither of you will do, must not do, is clarify. Clarification is a hammer in a world of teacups. It breaks the spell. Mystery in flirtation is not just acceptable, it's essential. You remember what your aunt once said, over marmalade and regret. If a man can hold his tongue, he might hold someone's hand by next Thursday. The sun is lower now. The final quarter hour of any garden party is when carriages are summoned, gloves are quietly inspected for grass stains, and elderly guests begin discussing railway timetables with alarming specificity. You and Lydia step slightly apart. Until next time? You ask, not quite a question. She doesn't answer. Instead, she holds up the bouquet you helped construct, slightly asymmetrical, slightly wild, and unmistakably yours, and gives the faintest curtsy a person can deliver while wearing a frown designed to trick her chaperone. And then she's gone. Carried away in a blur of bonnet box, and speculation. The gossip may grow. The pantry tale may twist. But you? You kept your dignity. You said just enough? And in a world where one whispered word can ripple through 10 conservatories, that might just be the greatest accomplishment of all. The garden now lies in that golden hush just before collapse. The tea table is empty but for a few crumbs and a single forgotten raspberry. The lace chairs are unoccupied except for a shawl someone will pretend to have never lost, and the last of the sun filters through the hedges like spilled syrup over toast. You stroll the main path once more, your boots brushing along flagstones scattered with flower bits and, for some reason, a small feather. Not a peacock feather, thankfully. Likely from a bonnet, perhaps shaken loose during a particularly animated comment about bee pollination. And it's here, on this quiet loop through what's left of the garden, that you stumble, almost literally, upon one final rule. Rule 19, the role of dogs, birds, and one ferret. Yes, the animals. Because no true Victorian garden party is complete without an uninvited creature of dubious purpose and entirely too much charisma. Animals were, unintentionally, the ultimate flirtation enhancers, disarming, distracting, and occasionally instigating romances that might never have happened without a bit of fur and confusion. You round a hedge and see it. A small dog. A mop of white fluff and determination trotting between the remains of 2 wicker chairs, holding in its mouth what appears to be a rolled-up napkin. Whether it was stolen or gifted, no one knows. The dog doesn't care. It sees you. You see it. It drops the napkin. Snorts. Then dashes off into the next hedgerow like a tiny, judgmental cloud. That, you suspect, was Miss Beadle's Pomeranian, Lord Waffles, if you recall correctly. A dog known equally for his fondness for sponge cake and his habit of interrupting proposals with well-timed barks. Victorian pets, especially those belonging to the upper classes, were often treated as extended family, or, in many cases, emotional stand-ins. If a guest couldn't express affection to a person, they might do so to their spaniel. If they couldn't cry over lost love, they might sob dramatically while brushing their Persian's tail. It was all very normal. And animals, unbound by social rules, had free rein to interfere with flirtation as they saw fit. Consider the following real, recorded incidents. In the summer of 1849, a cockatoo named Percival interrupted a game of whist by shrieking, "Marry him! Marry him!" after someone dropped a ring in a tart. The couple was already engaged. But the timing was so unnerving that they delayed the wedding by a full year. In 1862, a collie belonging to the Dowager Lady Glanville led 2 lost guests away from the kitchen garden and directly into a hedgerow conversation that, according to later reports, resulted in a proposal and a new appreciation for time. And in perhaps the most infamous case, a ferret belonging to a notoriously eccentric entomologist got loose during a May fete, climbed into a picnic basket, and bit a minor duke's cousin on the ankle. The resulting chaos scattered several potential romantic pairings. but united one couple who dove for the same sausage roll during the ferret's rampage. You can't make this up. Or rather, you don't need to. Animals functioned as both Cupid and Chaos. They were the only beings who could cross class lines without reproach, interrupt a conversation without scandal, and sniff at someone's shoe without ending a courtship. And so, it's no surprise that Lydia, yes, one more mention is allowed, had a small companion with her earlier. You remember it now. A little spaniel, possibly named Marmalade or Prudence, or something equally edible. It sat patiently by her parasol, barely barking, as if fully briefed on the stakes. What you might not have noticed, however, was the way that spaniel occasionally moved. Deliberately. Once toward your feet, when you and Lydia first crossed paths. Once beneath the croquet table, causing Reginald to step backward and very nearly into a flower arrangement. And once, most curiously, placing itself precisely in the path between you and Lydia's aunt during a crucial bouquet moment. Coincidence? Historians still argue whether Victorian pets were actively trained in social espionage, or simply had a knack for disrupting tension at precisely the right moment. Your personal theory? They just liked the drama. Even birds had their place. A well-timed robin chirp during a lull in conversation could redirect attention. A dove fluttering through the trellis added just the right amount of symbolism to a glance. And let us not forget the parrot that lived in the conservatory of Mrs. Twistleby, who learned to mimic the sentence, "You make my cravat itch," and repeated it, unsolicited, every time a certain suitor entered the room. Eventually, he changed tailors. Animals were also excellent exit cues. If a guest wished to escape a dull conversation, they might excuse themselves to check on a dog. If a flirtation had gone too far, one could always follow the cat or make sure the parakeet hasn't eaten the napkin ring again. They offered freedom where etiquette did not. Right now, you're watching a terrier carry someone's fan across the lawn. No one moves to stop it. Everyone simply accepts that the dog is now the custodian of flirtation's aftermath. And you realize, every creature here today has played a role in the story. The maids and their sidelong glances. The butlers and their perfectly timed interruptions. The aunties with their decoding eyes. And the animals, oh, the animals, tumbling through it all like punctuation marks in a sentence too florid to end. You bend down, pick up the napkin Lord Waffles abandoned, and fold it neatly beside a teacup. Nearby, someone thanks you. They think it's theirs. You smile. You say nothing. Because sometimes, the best way to continue a conversation is to leave it just slightly unfinished. The garden is no longer bathed in sunlight but in that soft, syrupy light that signals the end of something worth remembering. It's the hour when roses close up for the evening, when teacups are stacked like ceramic goodbyes, and when every glance carries the slight weight of maybe next time. Your limbs are tired in that lovely, loose way that comes from doing nothing physical except worrying about how not to be obvious while being just obvious enough. And you, having survived rules, rain, rodents, and rogue footmen, are at last ready to depart. Rule 20. When a wink did work. Let's not pretend the Victorians didn't wink. Of course they did. Just not like we do now, with cartoonish flair or cheeky vulgarity. Victorian winks were subtle. Rare. Earned. Deployed only when the moment was precisely right, and only when the receiver was prepared to receive it as a gift, not a gaffe. And yes, there were instances when a single, well-placed, blink-can-you-miss-it wink turned a polite afternoon into a lifetime of correspondence and carriage rides. You've made it to the gravel path by the main gate now. Not in a rush. There's no need. This is the final lap, the soft landing. You hold your bouquet, now a little frayed but still fragrant. You pass the statue of a Grecian nymph pretending not to look at anyone. And then, you see her. Lydia. One more time. She's near her carriage. Her aunt fusses with gloves. The footman is checking the wheels as if he's afraid they might roll into the pond. And Lydia, well, Lydia is not looking at you. Yet. This is the last moment. And history is full of people who botched it. People who said too much, who tried one last compliment that came out sounding like a riddle wrapped in a grammar mistake. People who bowed too deeply and knocked their own hat off. People who mistook a wave from a maid for a romantic overture and ended up writing 3 unread love letters to the wrong sister. But not you. You've earned this. Now you don't wave. That's too big. You don't bow again. Too repetitive. You simply catch her eye. Hold it. And wink. Tiny. Measured. One eye. No grin. Just a spark of shared memory, the kind that flickers in the space between gesture and laughter. She doesn't blush. Lydia doesn't blush. She registers. Her face moves through 3 emotions in under a second: amusement, surprise, and approval. Then she looks away. Her aunt sees none of it. The peacocks remain mercifully silent. And you? You walk away. Upright. Calm. Hands behind your back like a man who has neither offended a duchess nor knocked over a cake stand. You leave with dignity and a faint echo of sandalwood trailing behind. Now allow me to share with you 3 documented cases, real anecdotes from real garden parties, where the wink worked. Because yes, it did happen. Not often. But when it did, it stuck. Case 1, 1871, Wiltshire. A lady of modest means and astonishing eyebrows attended a summer tea at Ashcombe House. After exchanging no more than 6 sentences with the second son of a baronet, she winked, deliberately, brazenly, at the lemonade table. He was so stunned he dropped a biscuit. They were married the following spring. Guests recalled the moment with phrases like unexpected and bracing. Case 2, 1854, Kent. A naval officer, known for his strict discipline and abysmal sense of humor, winked at a vicar's daughter during a long game. No one had ever seen him so much as blink unnecessarily before. The entire party paused. Rumors flew. The daughter fainted, but it was warm and she'd had 4 currant buns. They were engaged within the week. Case 3, undated, but notorious. A wink so scandalous it caused a minor chaperone to cough uncontrollably into her own gloves. The details are murky. Some say it wasn't a wink but a twitch, others claim it was actually directed at a horse. But either way, it resulted in a courtship, an elopement, and one unusually bold haiku embroidered onto a handkerchief. The wink, you see, is the final act of earned intimacy. It's a recognition of the whole performance. A quiet signature scrawled at the end of a very long, very polite letter. You continue toward the gate. A child walks past you holding a melted toffee in one hand and a flower in the other, both being offered with the same gravity. Someone nearby is humming a tune that sounds suspiciously like the 3rd movement of that cello piece from earlier. And as you step past the gate, the estate now behind you, the world opens up again. The road is lined with trees. The hedges no longer hold secrets. The air is cooler now, touched with evening and the scent of too many roses packed too tightly into too many corsages. But within you, something glows. Not a certainty. Not a promise. Just the seed of something that could grow, slowly, quietly, like ivy climbing toward a window that's never been opened. Tomorrow, you'll wake up and wonder whether it meant something. Whether the bouquet will survive the carriage ride. Whether she remembered the time. Whether she winked back just after you turned. You'll probably never know. And that's the point. Because Victorian flirtation wasn't about confirmation, it was about possibility. The art of leaving a party not with a partner, but with a story. And tonight, my dear listener, you have one. And now you're walking, slowly, away from the estate, boots scuffed with gravel, gloves slightly creased, the air behind you heavy with the perfume of endings. There's no carriage waiting. Not yet. You're not in a rush. Who would be? Because this walk down the elm-lined path away from hedges and harpsichord overtures, from sponge cake and sideways glances, this is where the spell settles. This is the part no one talks about. But it's where everything lives. This is Rule 21. The farewell is the final impression. You think it would be the first thing, the handshake, the introduction, the way you bowed without knocking your hat askew. But no. The first impression is charming. The second, memorable. But the last, that's the one that echoes. Victorians took their goodbyes very seriously. You didn't just wave and shout cheers then, across the lawn like a tipsy sailor. You performed your farewell like the closing lines of a play, down to your posture, your tone, and the exact angle of your eyebrows. Guests often practice their exit lines ahead of time. Phrases like, "This afternoon shall linger sweetly in memory. Until the next rose blooms, dear lady." You've made a guest of a stranger and a poet of a guest. All terribly dramatic. All slightly overwrought. And yet, all perfectly in keeping with a society that used 5 forks just to eat a melon. You didn't do any of that, of course. You walked out with a wink and a handful of scented foliage. And in doing so, you may have just rewritten the exit code altogether. Still, you reflect on the farewells you could have offered. If today was written in petals, yours would be the brightest. I have no hat to tip, but my thoughts incline toward you. Next time, perhaps we'll finish that croquet match. I hope your bouquet doesn't wilt before you read it. Each one lovely, Nunn said. Because, and this is critical, sometimes restraint is louder than romance. Victorians knew that too. They may have filled parlors with chatter and partridges, but their deepest moments happened in the silence after the words. And as you continue your solitary stroll down the lane, the garden behind you dissolving into the distance, you start to feel the weight of what you didn't say, and the joy in having not said it. Let's talk briefly about parting objects. It was quite common, expected, even, for something small to be exchanged during goodbyes. A favor. A pressed bloom. A handkerchief folded just so. Sometimes, a lady would return a borrowed fan with an extra ribbon tied to it, just to say, "Yes, I noticed." Other times, a gentleman would leave a glove behind intentionally, knowing full well it would be returned, with commentary, via chaperone courier by morning. One diarist wrote, "I never loved her as I did when I realized she stole my cufflink, and that I missed it not from vanity but from hope." Now that's an exit. And what of your own object? The bouquet, of course. A little frayed. Slightly flattened where you gripped it too tightly during that near collision with the hedgehog-shaped shrubbery. But still vibrant. Still alive. Still full of everything that went unspoken. In fact, the bouquet itself has transformed. No longer just a symbol of flirtation, it is now the artifact of a memory. You could press it between pages. Place it in a bowl beside a candle. Or, if you're feeling poetic, leave it anonymously on the doorstep of the next person whose company deserves a little thrill. You pause now by a low stone wall, lichen-flecked and wonderfully sun-warmed even at this hour. You rest your bouquet there for a moment, just to feel the absence of it in your hands. And that's when it happens. A breeze. Light. Unremarkable. Except for the way it nudges a single pansy loose, just one, and carries it in a lazy arc down the path. You watch it tumble. You don't chase it. You simply nod. That pansy will go somewhere. Maybe into the wheel of a departing carriage. Maybe onto the bonnet of someone who was secretly hoping for a sign. Maybe nowhere at all. But it has left you now. And that's what farewells are meant to do. Historians still argue whether Victorian romance ended with goodbye or with "until we meet again." But you, with your collection of signals and secrets, you know better. The best endings blur gently into beginnings. Not with declarations, but with gestures. With posies. With a wink. And with the echo of your boots, slowly making their way home. And now, dear listener, the party is over. The garden has gone quiet, the carriages have rolled into the velvet dusk, and the laughter has folded itself neatly into the hedgerows, waiting for morning. You're tucked beneath your blankets now, the way the ivy tucks around the base of the old fountain, unmoving, soft, and sure of your place. The air is still, the room dark but safe. Your eyes, perhaps, are just barely open, or just barely closed. Let the bouquet fade now. Let the chatter of aunties dissolve into silence, their fans folded and stored for another season. The teacups have been washed, the peacocks tucked into their improbable nests, and the footmen? Even they are finally asleep. You did well today. You dodged scandal, learned codes, matched wits, and maybe, just maybe, left with more than you arrived with. Not in your hands? Not even in your bouquet, but in your chest. Something warmer, something a little giddy, something folded carefully like a letter you're not quite ready to send. Breathe in now. Let the croquet lawn vanish behind your eyelids. Let the perfume of rose and rainwater drift away like fog on morning glass. Let the soft murmurs of floriography fade into nothing but syllables of rest. You are safe here. You are still. And the story has ended exactly as it should. Unfolding quietly, like a silk glove falling to the floor of a sleeping ballroom. Sleep now, darling listener. You're not in the garden anymore. You're home.